Family secrets are the most tantalizing kind. The people you trust most, and they refuse to let you in on something, but that usually means it's for your own good. That is the case in today's story. An anonymous sender sent this story to me titled Longhead, and oddly enough it reminds me a great deal of my Doghead creepypasta, in a very good way. Maybe I inspired someone, but who knows. Anyway, in this story, a man recalls his time as a young boy after his dad left. His mother moved them in to live with their great-aunt for a while, but during his stay, he begins to grow fearful and suspicious of her stuffed borzoi. This is Unexplained Encounters. I'm Darkness Prevails. Now, let's begin. My great-aunt Julie died last March. She was 96 years old. She lived in a retirement home the last 6 years. By the end of it, she didn't even know my mother's name, her own niece, and that really messed with my mother. I flew back for the service, and I stayed a week to help clean out her house. I was one of the unlucky ones who didn't have kids or a family, so I was always at the call when the family needed something. So I get volunteered for things a lot. Her house is actually where we lived from 1996 to 1999. Me, my mother, and my 2 sisters. I'm here today to tell you about those 3 creepy and weird years. And I'm not sure you're gonna believe all of it. So, my father left in the spring of 1996. All I remember back then was that my father left for work that day, and he just didn't come back. He did call 11 days later from Jacksonville, and probably for my sake and my sister's sakes, that's all my mother ever said. Of course, with the main earner gone, we soon lost our home in town. My mother, you can call her Charlene, had been working part-time at a doctor's office. She had to pick up more hours and it wasn't nearly enough. So she did what she had to do. She didn't want to do it, but she sucked it up anyway. She called her aunt. Julie was my grandmother's older sister. She was 70 years old at the time, so old then, right? And by then she had been a widow for 15 years. All those years she lived alone on 11 acres, about 20 minutes outside of town or so she had nobody to talk to, but she did have a phone on the kitchen wall that she liked to use, and the cord on that thing could reach around the entire house probably twice over. Julie said yes. She seemed almost excited about it from what I heard on the phone. My mother looked so relieved. Julie didn't even ask how long we needed, or about money either. She said, according to my mother, "Come on, I've got more house than sense." That's the kind of person Julie was, and despite her eccentricities, I loved her for that. Before I knew it, we were turning off the road onto a dirt track with pecan trees planted down both sides, and the trees had not been tended to apparently since, I would learn, the 60s, so they had grown into each other overhead, and you could drive the last stretch in shade. When the track finally opens up, there's her house. It was a white clapboard house, 2 stories, with a porch running the whole front and around the east side. Her late husband's, Earl's, grandfather, put it up sometime around 1910, and someone in the family had lived in the place ever since. Out back was a barn that had been vacant of animals for decades. There was a well house too, and a burn barrel. Beyond that was the woods and a fence line, then more of the same for a good half-mile before you hit the neighbor's place. Inside her house, it was very clean, and yet worn out at the same time. The wallpaper was turning yellow in spots. She had a window unit in the front bedroom, and box fans everywhere else, at least a dozen of the dang things. I remember the first time I tasted water at her house. Well water, and it tasted like a dirty penny. She had 4 bedrooms upstairs. Julie put my sisters in one room, and me in another. My mother got the 3rd, while Julie kept sleeping downstairs in the little room off the kitchen, like she always had. Allow me to introduce my sisters. Tessa was 14 when we moved in, and I gotta say there's no worse age to get relocated 9 miles from everybody you once knew. She spent the first half year acting like she'd been sentenced. Nell was 5, so she thought the whole thing was a big vacation. I was in between, at 9 years old. I need to explain the front room now. The house had a front room off the entry hallway that nobody used. Every old house down there had one of these rooms. It was the room with the good furniture and the china cabinet. It was covered in framed photos, and it seemed to exist just to be looked at. You might sit in it twice a year when the preacher came over or something like that, but most of the time it stayed shut. Whenever I was in that room or near the doorway when the door was opened, it smelled of dust and cedar. I would soon discover that standing in that room on a low wooden base about 6 inches off the floor, in front of the window that looked out at the front yard, was Joyce. Joyce was the name of Aunt Julie's Borzoi. Borzoi are quite the breed. They're the tall Russian dogs, wolfhounds and sighthounds, big dogs that get to 70 or 80 pounds, but they're built really narrow. They look like someone stretched out a normal dog long ways. They have deep chests and waists you could almost put your hands around, but legs like a table. And the head is the craziest part. A Borzoi's head is long and narrow, and from the ears to the nose it's almost completely straight, with only a slight curve down at the end. The whole skull is basically one long shape. Julie got Joyce as a puppy in 1968, and she passed away in 1974, so Julie had her mounted. She talked about the real dog sometimes. She said that Joyce would run down a rabbit in an open field, then not even want it once she caught it. She said the dog would sleep on the porch in the sun, like she had been poured out onto the porch instead of laying on it. Earl was still alive then, and the two of them never had their own children. I've always kind of figured that dog occupied a spot in her life that was meant for a child. So I understood the impulse to have it mounted. Even though I would never do it myself, I sort of get it. People have their dogs taxidermied. It's not common, but not unheard of, and out where we were in 1974, you didn't have specialists. You would instead have some dude who did deer usually. So that's who she used. Apparently, it was the first guy she could find within 100 miles who could mount white-tailed deers for hunters. He had never in his life done a dog, though, and you could tell when you looked at Joyce. There was a lot of wrongness to the way Joyce looked. It was more like 100 small portions of the poor dog's skin were placed and stretched to where they should be. And every time I saw someone new see that dog for the first time, you could see it in their eyes and expression. That I nearly jumped startled look. The coat, though, was fine. It was really long and silky still, with white and tan patches over the shoulders, and one across the hip. From across the room in dim light, with the fur laying just right, it almost looked like a dog standing in a window. But take one step and you'd see that the whole shape was disturbing. I always told myself it looked so weird, because to me it looked like a deer man had built a deer body, then remembered, oh yeah, this is for a dog. Deer are thick where a Borzoi is thin. There was too much space in the chest, and not enough space in the flank, as if he had compensated. So poor old Joyce had this heavy front end and a back half that was almost caved in. The legs were also too straight. Dogs don't stand with all 4 legs like straight up posts. They stand a little uneven. But that thing stood like a sawhorse. To my sister Tessa, the eyes were horrifying. They were glass and round eyes, but a Borzoi's eyes, any dog's eyes, are not perfectly round things. They're not perfect little marbles. They're at a slant and a little sunken. But these sat out too far, and they caught the light from the hallway, making it almost look like they were following you as you walked. And for my sister Nell, the mouth was the worst. The guy had sewed the lip up a hair short on the left side, so about a 1/4 inch of tooth showed, just enough that if you were 5 years old, you would think it was smiling at you. To me, I absolutely hated the seam. There was a seam all the way around the neck. It wasn't accidental, it was on purpose. A seam right down where the neck met the shoulders, going all the way around like a carved-in collar. The fur had been parted along it in a clean line, and if you got up close to it and looked real good, you could see the stitching in there. Heavy, dark thread, more like the kind of stuff you'd find on a boot rather than a body. One day when Julie was in the kitchen, I went up to her. "Why does Joyce have a line around her neck?" I asked. "Well, that's just how they decided to do it," she said, without even looking at me. "But why all the way around?" I asked. "You little weasel." That's what she liked to call me. My name is Wesley, and she always called me Weasel. "You ask 100 questions a day, and I've got things to do." I was sort of satisfied with her answer and walked away. I understood adults would explain things wrong or in lies or partial lies just to get kids to leave them alone or to get them away from answers they weren't ready for. Like when a kid comes up and asks, "How are babies made?" But that didn't keep me from having my own theory at the time. Instead, I was thinking you stitch stuff to keep it in place. So Joyce's stitches around her neck were to keep her head on. So, did Joyce's head come off? Julie had rules for her house. Just a few. She let us know about them the first week. Don't touch the dog. Rule number 1. You could go in the front room, nobody said you couldn't, but you did not put your hands on old Joyce. Julie dusted Joyce herself once a week, and she said she would know if Joyce had been touched. Number 2, when it gets dark, come back inside. That's not a strange one at all. That's a normal rule for a woman who is already too old to be handling kids, and didn't want kids unfamiliar with the woods to go exploring woods and getting lost. My mother gave us the same rule before we even got there. Number 3, the back door stays unlatched. That one was weird to me. There was a hook and an eye on the kitchen door to the back steps. Julie never used it. I never saw her use it, at least. And she didn't want it to be used. Tessa latched it one night in October, sort of automatically. She was a 14-year-old girl and had watched a scary movie. Later, Julie came by and unhooked it, and in the morning, without any heat at all, she said, "Hon, please don't latch that door, okay?" My mother asked, "Julie, what's with that door?" And Julie, her reply, if I remember correctly, was something like, if someone wants in a house, they get in a house, and a hook wasn't going to do anything but cost you a door. That sounded like paranoia or pessimism to me. Or maybe it's just something an old country woman would say. Then there was the last rule. If you hear walking at night, stay in bed. She explained she didn't sleep very good these days, so she would get up and move around. She didn't want 4 people coming out in the hallway concerned every time we heard her walking about. Made sense to me. Turns out, though, there was walking every single night. It wasn't most nights or some nights. Every night we lived in that house, I heard walking. It started somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and it would go on for hours. It was a light and steady walk, like someone pacing when they're mid-thought. It went up the hall and it came back down the hall. Then it went up to the front of the house and came back. Then it would do that again and again. There was no getting a drink pause in it, no resting, no toilet break. Imagine steady, constant walking while you're trying to fall back to sleep. I swear, sometimes when I woke up around 5, it was still going. It was quiet steps too, like tiptoe light, which to me sounded like my Aunt Julie just being polite, doing her usual walking, but now that she had guests, she was softening up her steps. Yeah, it all made sense to us kids. Old women can't sleep too good, everybody knows that. And we had a comparison because my grandmother didn't sleep very well either. She sometimes called my mother at 5 in the morning to talk about a coupon. So when we heard the walking, what we heard was Aunt Julie, up again, poor thing, wandering around the house in the dark because her body just wouldn't let her rest. Tessa used to do an impression of it. She'd creep around the upstairs hall on her toes with her arms out. She was funny. Nell would just about die laughing. I didn't really put 2 and 2 together until much later in my life. But Julie, being 70 years old, then 71 and 72 while we were there, she had a bad hip since day 1, and we would watch her use the rail on the stairs when she went up and down, taking them one at a time. And that did not properly match up to a walking sound each and every night that would go on unstopped for 4 or 5 hours, without a slowdown or hitch over those years, despite Aunt Julie getting older. No, Julie could not have made those steps, let alone do it for 20 minutes. Our time at Aunt Julie's was pretty good, though. We were broke, and my mother cried in the car sometimes. I know she thought we couldn't see her, but we could. But we were still doing better than good. That house had a porch you could sit on all evening, and a big yard with no neighbors in it. The pecans from the trees you could go pick up and crack with a brick. Julie even taught me to shell butter beans and shuck corn. Then she had me pushing the mower to mow the lawn. She taught Nell all sorts of card games, but never once let her win. My mother thought that was unfair, and Nell to this day says that is why she's so competitive. She and Tessa fought like cats for about a year, then somewhere along the line, they became something close to best friends. And by the end, Tessa was the one who'd sit up with her at the kitchen table. But Aunt Julie, she teased me constantly. That was her love language. "Weasel, get your feet off my chair. Weasel, you've got a head like a mailbox." If I ever came home with a haircut, she would let me hear about it for the next week. When I got glasses in 4th grade, she looked at me and said, "Well, now you look like somebody who knows a thing or two." Thanks, Aunt Julie. Her sister, my grandmother, came out most Sundays, and the two of them would sit on the porch talking for hours about people and stuff. A lot of people who had been dead for decades. My mother would come out too, getting pulled into it. She was not a spooky old woman in a spooky old house. In stories like this one, the aunt is always some hollowed-eyed crone, muttering at the walls. But Julie watched Wheel of Fortune. She had opinions about the church organist, and she drove a brown Oldsmobile 8 miles an hour under the limit, with both hands on the wheel. The only thing about Aunt Julie was not Aunt Julie herself. It was that darned dog she kept in the house. Aunt Julie would dust Joyce every Saturday. I saw her do it a few times. She would take a soft rag and she'd go in there, and she'd wipe down the whole thing. Top of the head, down the back, each leg. She'd be done in about 90 seconds. Pretty fast. Faster than I would expect from a woman who was so protective of that dog. Not to mention, nothing Julie did was fast. She also held her breath. It reminded me of when I had to take out my little sister's diaper pail, back when she was still in diapers. Right before I opened that nasty thing, I would hold my breath, open it, and pull out the bag and tie it as fast as I could, trying not to pass out from holding my breath too long. It was a race to get it done. And that's what Julie acted like. She'd take a breath at the door of that room, and she'd hold it the entire time almost, as she wiped away at that dog to dust it. Sometimes I'd hear her come back out in the hallway and take in a big breath of air, or release a big one that she'd been holding in. Another thing is she never talked to Joyce. Maybe that's weird, maybe it's not, but I figured I would bring it up. Aunt Julie was quite the talker. She would talk to her car, the pecan trees even, to a jar of pickles that wouldn't open. She said good morning to Earl's picture in the hall every day of her life. But every time I saw her wipe down that dog, not a single word was spoken. One time I heard her say something in that room, though. I'd come downstairs for water, and she was in the doorway of the front room. Her back was to me. She wasn't going into the room, just standing in the doorway, in the dark, and it looked like she was looking at Joyce. Then I heard her say in a low voice, like talking to a dog that was still alive, "Go on now." Then she saw me standing there and told me to get my water and go on back to bed. This kid named Dewey came to visit us in the summer one time. Dewey was the son of the nearest neighbor to Aunt Julie, just about a half-mile through that pine forest, or a full mile if you went around by the road. Dewey was my age, maybe a year older. We'd been in the same class for 2 years, and yet this was the first time he ever came out to the house. His mother had dropped him off. He was weird about it from the second he got out of the car. He kept looking at the house, like it was going to pounce on him, and he would not go in through the front door. He would only go into the house if it was through the kitchen with me. Once we were up in my room on a hot day enjoying the box fan, and he said to me, "You know what people say about this house?" No. They say something about this place?" He nodded. He said, "This is the haunted one." "That sounds stupid," I told him. "Nuh-uh, everyone knows this house is haunted." Then I told him, "Well, I live here, and nobody told me." He rolled his eyes and replied, "Well, they're not going to say it to you, because you live here. That would be, like, rude." Then I said it again. "That's stupid." He smiled smugly. "Well, a man hung himself in that barn out there." "No, he did not." "Did too. My cousin told me." "When did it happen?" "I don't know when. A long time ago. And there's a baby buried out in them pecan trees out there." I actually laughed. "There's not a baby buried out there." "Uh-huh. If you went out with a shovel, you'd find it." I then explained how I knew it wasn't true, because every legend like that has its own baby buried in the lawn somewhere. The place we lived at before had its own dead baby legend, and I wasn't about to believe another one. Dewey then said, "Okay, well, my daddy won't even drive past y'all's road at night." "Why?" "He just won't. He goes all the way around instead. That's 4 extra miles, and he does it every time." "Did you ever ask him why he does that?" "Yeah, one time." I waited. "Well, what did he say?" "Oh, he said that's just the way we go." "Dewey, that doesn't mean anything." I laid my head down in my arms, getting a little bit annoyed. "Well, what about this?" he said. I looked up at him with one eye. "Have you ever seen the Stick Man?" Now he had my attention. I've heard plenty of ghost stories and boogeymen, but not the Stick Man. No, never heard of that, unless you mean like drawing it on paper." "No, I don't mean the thing you draw on paper. I saw it once. You know where the fence line is along the field out there? I was out there one day, and it was getting dark. And I swear I saw something out there on our side of the fence. It was standing in the grass." "What it looked like?" "It was standing like a person, and it..." "So it was just a person?" "No, let me finish. It wasn't a person. But it looked like it was made out of sticks, like the legs were sticks. A whole bunch of them bunched up together. Like this." He put his fingers together in a bundle and squeezed them tight. "And it was just walking." "Oh, what did it do? Did it go anywhere?" "It walked across the field, and it went fast. And it walked like some guy on stilts." "Well, how big was it?" "Taller than a grown man." I suddenly felt a heat in my chest and face, like an irritation. I realized now what I was feeling. My Aunt Julie's house had become our home, and now some neighbor kid had the gall to come over here and tell me that our place was the bad haunted place with a monster on it. "You're crazy," I told him. "It was probably just a deer." "It wasn't a deer." "Well, you said it was getting dark, and it was way out in the field. If you saw a big buck far away in some tall grass at night, it'll probably look like anything you want it to look like. My uncle says people sight Bigfoot every year, and it's always just a deer standing funny." That was a lie, actually. I did not have an uncle who said that. I'd only heard someone say that at some tire shop. Dewey shook his head. "Whatever," he said. I could tell he didn't want to keep arguing about it. We went and played some Nintendo for a few hours. Then his mother came and picked him up. Dewey never came back to that house again, as long as I knew him. But I never asked him to come out either. But I remembered what he said for all time. He said it was tall as a man, maybe taller. Maybe it was a dude on stilts. Maybe he had mistaken a tree for something more alive. But I didn't let Dewey's story scare me, even though I probably should have. After my encounter with Dewey and his story, I became more perceptive and cautious about Aunt Julie's place. To be honest, his story did creep me out a little bit, and I was a bit on edge for a few days after. During that time, I did notice some things. even though Aunt Julie dusted down Joyce every Saturday. The front room itself was only swept about once a month, if that. But one time when I went in there, I noticed a little bit of stuff at the base of where Joyce stood. A little sand and grit, red clay, dried into flakes. And the day after that, I found pine straw, just a little bit, like 3 or 4 brown needles, just on the floor there. But they weren't anywhere else. Now, how could that be? A room that almost everybody avoided or didn't go in that much. How could it have been tracked in here, but only in one spot by the base of the thing we weren't allowed to touch? Very weird, I thought. Now, remember I said that room always smelled like dust and cedar. But I noticed there were some mornings, always mornings, where you could walk past that door and get a whole different scent, and it would smell briefly like the outside, like wet or dewy ground, smelled like freshly rained on dirt. After these 2 noticings, I made up my mind about breaking Aunt Julie's rule. I put my hand on Joyce. Yeah, I know I'd been told explicitly not to do that for years now. But I remember it was a Saturday morning. Mom took my sisters into town, so the house was empty. I went in that room specifically to break that rule. It likely didn't help that I was at a rebellious age. I put my hand flat on her shoulder. Her fur was damp, like it wasn't recently wet, but wet an hour ago. It was cool and heavy in the fur. When I pulled my hand away, there was a smear of that red clay across my palm. When I had her alone, I told Tessa about it. Nobody else. Tessa was 16 by then, and had gotten to where she talked to me like a person at long last, but only half the time. I expected her to laugh at me, but she said instead, "Okay, weird question for you. What is it?" When Aunt Julie walks around at night, have you ever seen a light come on, under the door or in the hallway, coming up from downstairs? I thought about it, and she was right. No, actually. Her eyes got wide. Exactly. If an old lady is walking around the house in pitch darkness, she would turn on a light, not risk breaking a hip. But no, we never see a light come on. But why? We sat there for a minute. Tessa eventually came up with an idea. Maybe she's lived here long enough that she knows the place like the back of her hand. She's got like old person's echolocation. She doesn't need a light. Maybe. I smiled for a quick second, then said, Yeah, that's it. The spring of 1999, my mother had started talking about a place in town, a rental on the north side. There was a real feeling then that we might be living in a new place come summer. But with spring, there was cleaning we had to do. Always spring cleaning. Julie sent me up in the attic to bring down boxes of Christmas things. I went up there with a flashlight, as the bulb was out, and I was up for a good half hour, going through junk that had not been moved or touched in probably 30 years. I found some things up there, like a wooden base, which was about the size of a doormat, dark stained oak with a beveled edge. It took me a second to realize it was the exact same kind of base that Joyce stood on downstairs. It was the same kind of wood and bevel, same everything. It had 4 little holes in the top of it where the legs of something had been bolted through, and the holes were not where a dog's legs would go. They were closer together than that, more square. I looked at it with a flashlight in my mouth, just wondering why it would be up here, why there was another one. Then I put it back where I found it. Then I found the other thing, which was a photograph. It was in a shoebox of loose pictures, and that was the single most upsetting object I've ever held in my hands. The photo was in black and white, with a white scalloped border. The photo showed the front room of Aunt Julie's house, taken from the doorway. Same window and wallpaper and all that, but darker and newer looking. There was different furniture in there. A woman sat in a chair on the left side of the frame, older and in a dress with little round glasses. She was looking straight at the camera. I didn't know her, and that threw me off for a second, because everything else in that attic was ours, our family's. But Julie married into that house. It was Earl's family that built it and Earl's family that lived in it, so that woman must have been one of them, which made her nothing to me at all. And on the right side of that frame, in front of the window on a low, dark base, there was a mounted animal. But it wasn't a dog. It was smaller, low and long, and it had a narrow head with a pointed nose, ears perked up. A fox, I thought. Probably. Something like a fox. The picture wasn't good enough to swear by it, and the flash had blown out most of the detail on the white parts of the creature. But I could see the base, and I could tell it was the same kind. And I noticed, right where the neck met the shoulders on that weird animal, there was a line all the way around it. A seam. Quietly, I put the shoebox back, and I brought down the Christmas boxes, and I remember Julie making me a sandwich. 2 weeks after that, I saw it. The window in my room faced the front of the house and looked down over the yard and the pecan track. It was too hot, and the box fan wasn't doing anything, so I had the window all the way up. That night, or very early in the morning, I woke up around 2, sweating and annoyed that I was awake. After rubbing my eyes and sitting up, I realized how quiet the house was. Remember, for 3 years now, every night, I'd been hearing those footsteps. Other kids might fall asleep to a highway, but I fell asleep to that. I lay there in the dark, genuinely now bothered by this quietness. It would be like the ticking of a clock just stopping in a silent class. I got out of bed, and I went to the window for some air. As I did, I looked out to the yard. There was something down there. Whatever it was out past the big pecan, about 60 feet from the house. It was standing still in the grass. There was a decent moon that night. Not full, but enough that I could see, and it gave the yard a pale blue shimmer. Whatever it was, it appeared to be about 6 feet tall. And it was thin, incredibly thin. The legs were not legs. They appeared more like bundles, tight groupings of long, thin pieces, held together somehow, 4 or 5 to a limb. And where they came together at the top, there was a body that was hardly a body at all, just more of the same bundled things together. On top of it, there was a head. A long head. Even at 60 feet, in that pale light, even with me not wearing my glasses at the moment, it was long and narrow, running straight from the ears to the nose, and I knew what it was I was looking at. Joyce's head. And its head turned on that stack of sticks body, as smooth as a person turning around to look at a sound they'd heard. And it looked up at the house. I don't think it was looking at me, but at the house in general. I then watched it walk. Dewey had been right about that part. It went off toward the side yard, and it did not walk like an animal or a man. It walked like a man on stilts, who had gotten beyond good at it. Every step went too far, and it never wobbled a single time. And as it walked, it never made a single sound. It crossed 15 yards of dry grass in June in Georgia, and there wasn't so much as a rustle. Nothing at all. I stood at the window until it went around the corner of the house where I could no longer see it. About a minute later, I heard the walking start up downstairs. Goosebumps covered my entire body in the matter of 3 seconds. I'm not sure how long I stood there at the window, but eventually I got back in bed, treading more quietly than I ever had before. I laid on my side facing the door with my eyes open until light. I didn't do anything about it for 7 weeks. I've heard people say they don't understand how a person can know a thing or see a thing like that and just go on eating cereal and bacon for breakfast. But now that I had gone through it, I understood it just fine. You have to be normal. And the more normal you can go through, the more you can stack up and tell yourself that what you saw wasn't real, or at least you can forget it. School let out. We swam at Dewey's Pond, which is funny to me now. My mother got approved for the rental, and we were set to move come August. Nell turned 8, and we had a cake on the porch, and Jolie made her this cool paper crown. But then that thought would come, that image of what I saw that night, around 2 in the afternoon, or randomly in the morning, or flooding me underneath my closed eyes in the middle of the night, keeping me awake. And I'd lie there listening to something walking up the hall and back down, something that I was now so very sure was not my Aunt Julie. I started checking the front room. Not every day, but I'd stop in the doorway on my way through, and I would look at Joyce standing there in the window, light coming in on her disgusting neck. I'd look at that seam, then I'd go about my business. Then I got, well, the best word for this is, insulted. I was 12 years old, and I was mad that something was walking around the house every single night, and mad that Dewey's dad went 4 miles out of his way to avoid our land, and upset that my aunt let something have the run of the place, let something make the rules about it, and wouldn't say what they were for. I was mad that I was leaving in a month, and nobody was ever going to say one true word to me about any of this crap. I wanted to see it, in the light, up close with the door shut behind me. I wanted to hold the proof of it in my 2 hands and know it wasn't a nightmare. That's all it was, and it was never a good reason to do what I did. This happened the last week of July. I woke up around 1:30 a.m. I lay there awake for a while, listening for sounds around the house. I had made a habit of listening for where that thing had gotten off to inside. It was down at the far end now, way off. You could hear it going along the back hall by that little room off the kitchen where Julie slept. I got up, making sure not to make much noise. I didn't have a plan. A goal, but not a plan. I got out of bed in a t-shirt and gym shorts, no shoes, and I walked slowly down the stairs in the dark on the outsides of my feet to keep quiet. Every single step I took, I was telling myself in my head, just look, just take a peek. I found the front room door open. At night, unless Julie was standing in the doorway to that room, she never left the door open. After dark, it sat shut always. I stood in that hall for a while looking at a dark rectangle where that door should have been closed. I could smell the outside, that wet ground smell I told you about. I went in, and I turned on the light to the front room. Joyce was on her base, all 4 legs, same as usual. But there was nothing on top of her neck. Just the ring, a clean dark circle where her head was supposed to be, about 3 inches across, with the stitching pulled open all the way around and the ends of the thread hanging loose. Inside it was hollow, dark, and dry, with nothing in it. An empty wooden chamber. I stared for a moment, my hand still on the light switch. And then I did the stupidest thing I have ever done in my life. I picked up Joyce's body, and I took her with me. I put both arms around that body and picked it up off the base. It was light. I should have known it would be when I learned it was hollow. And then I started for the kitchen. My plan now, if you want to call it that, had assembled itself in a matter of seconds. I was going to put her out on the back step, outside, where anybody could see her in the morning, where my mother and Tessa and Nell and Aunt Julie would all have to come out that kitchen door and look at a headless dog standing in the yard. Somebody would finally have to say something out loud about it. I wanted a grown adult to have to admit something, because everything was just too weird. I got 4 steps into the hall, and the footsteps changed. The walking, which had been way off down the back hall, going along at its same steady pace it had gone for 3 years, was now going at a different speed. It wasn't loud, it never was. It went from a walk to something with a lot more steps in it. Quick and light. The usual footsteps I'd heard. They went tick, 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 tick. But what I heard that night was a tick, 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 tick. And it was coming up the back hall toward the kitchen, and coming fast. I've never moved so quick in my life, and I've never been so slow. I got to the kitchen door with that thing in my arms, and I could hear her in the back hall, 10 feet beyond the other side of that wall, coming. I hit the doorway, and I made it maybe 3 steps across the kitchen floor when I dropped Joyce's body. She hit the linoleum on her side, sliding then stopping against the leg of the table. I ran for the pantry. The pantry was on the left side of the kitchen. It had been a canning room once, so it was deep and narrow, 4 feet wide and 8 feet back, with shelves up both sides full of mason jars and a bare bulb on a pull chain. It had a real door, a solid one. It had been built to hold the cold in, but there was no lock. There was never a lock in that door. It was a food closet, but it opened inward. I got in, and I got the door shut as quick as I could. I then sat down on the floor with my back to the door. My feet were up on the bottom shelf across from me, and I pushed, and I pushed. 4 feet is about right for a 12-year-old to do that. If it was any further away, I could not have reached it. Thank God for those 4 feet. That's when something blocked out the light from the crack under the door. It hit the door. There was a scrabble, a fast, dry scratching sound high up on both sides. Sounded like a dog wanting in, except a dog has paw pads. But this thing had nothing but points. It was the sound of a handful of sticks dragging down a door over and over, raking against it. This happened for some time. When it stopped, something went down to the bottom of the door. There was a gap under that door of maybe 1.5 inches. An older house, so a bigger gap. The first one came in right beside my hip. A long, thin piece of brown, big around as a pencil. It came out from under that door, slow and feeling around like an antenna, side to side. A big wooden finger going along a wall for a light switch. It swept across the floor, touching the side of my leg through my shorts, and I wanted to scream when I felt it. I didn't move. I just kept pushing. I could not get away from it. If I tried to get further away from it, it would come through the door. The second I took my back off that door was when that door would come open, and that creature would come in and get me. So I dug my heels in harder, my legs shaking, and I let it touch me. More of them came, 4 or 5 of them, feeling around on both sides of me. They went across the floor and back until one of them found my hand where it was flat on the boards. It went over the top of my hand and kept going. I remember thinking it felt like a broom straw. But unlike sticks or branches, these weren't exactly stiff. They bent where they pleased, as if they had joints wherever they needed. After several minutes of this, they all pulled back at once, and everything went quiet. A moment later, I heard something settle down on the floor out there, That's when it put its head down sideways to look under the door. You could fit a Borzoi's head pretty far under an 1.5-inch gap like that. And so it did. It turned its head sideways and pushed as far as it would go. I could see about 1/3 of it reaching through. The bulb was on over my head in that pantry, so I saw it clearly. The long head sideways on the floor, and one single round glass deer eye looking straight at me. It didn't blink. I don't think it even could. And unlike a snarling and sniffing dog, it saw me and stopped. It just sat there on its side, only about 2 feet from my own face, and it stared at me. This part I can't tell you for sure how long it lasted. Could have been 10 minutes. The scratching and the reaching and the eye thing. It happened so fast. The head pulled away so suddenly that I got startled, and something got up off the floor. Footsteps went out of the kitchen. Tick, tick, tick. And after a moment, I heard the back door smack the frame. Somebody had walked out. The house then went quiet. I did not take my back off that door. My legs were cramping up something fierce, but I kept them exactly where they were. At some point I had to let just one rest, so I did that, and when the other began to give out, I'd switch them. I stayed back to that door until I saw light coming through the crack, and that last hour I was in there, I cried. It started as scared crying and turned into confused crying, and eventually that was just crying that loops in on itself, like a little kid does. They cry and eventually they just keep crying because of the momentum of it. And I'm not ashamed to say that I soiled myself. I never once thought about opening that door, though, no matter how desperately I wanted to run for my mom. Not one time. 20 feet of hallway and a staircase, it never entered my head as an option, because what was in my head was the idea that it was out there, waiting for me to walk out that door, waiting for me to let my guard down. The bulb remained on the whole night. There were a few moments I was terrified at the idea that it might go out, but it didn't. I didn't pull the chain. I'd have sat there with that light on until I died before I made that room go dark. At some point after it got full light out, Jolie tried the pantry door. It moved about 1 inch and stopped against my back. I felt it and nearly screamed, thinking it was something else. I didn't move, and I kept pushing. She tried again, then said, "Wesley?" She didn't call me Weasel. I swear the whole 3 years we were in that house, I don't think that woman called me Wesley again one time. I got off the floor, and I got out of the way. The door came open. Julie was dressed with her hair done and shoes on, at 6 a.m. for some reason. She looked at me, and I probably looked a mess. I recall barely being able to stand. My legs were trembling so badly. I expected her to gasp or something, but she didn't. She didn't even look surprised. She looked me over for about 2 seconds, then at the floor at the bottom of the door. There were scratches on the outside, and a wet spot where I'd been sitting. Rather than being scared, concerned, furious, one of the emotions I expected to see come from her, they didn't. What I saw was heartbreak go across her face. She reached out a hand and said, "Come here, Weasel." Joyce was back in the front room, standing on her base in the window with her head on. I think Aunt Julie must have done that before she came to find me. Sometime between it leaving me at the pantry and her opening that pantry door, my 73-year-old aunt with a bad hip carried that body back down the hall and set it back on the bolts where it belonged. Now, the process of her getting the head back where it goes, I couldn't begin to tell you how that went. I sat at the kitchen table. She gave me a glass of milk, but my stomach hurt too much to drink. "What did you do?" she asked. I touched her. It was a while back. I put my hand on her, and I found out she was wet." I waited for a moment to see if she would say something, but she didn't. "And Aunt Julie, I saw it. Out the window one night. It was out by the big pecan. It was standing there, and it went off around the side of the house. I didn't tell nobody. I didn't tell Mama. I swear I didn't tell anyone." "All right, settle down." "And there's a picture in the attic." That one made one of her eyebrows raise up. "In the shoebox. It showed this room, the front room. And there's a lady sitting in the chair, and there's something standing on a base just like Joyce, but it's not Joyce. It's different. A littler one, with a pointy nose. But it's got the same line around its neck." "That was a fox," she said. I sat there and went quiet. Then I confessed. I was gonna put her out in the yard," I said. "When she got up to walk, I went to get her to put her in the yard." "Where she couldn't get back to herself?" "Yes, ma'am." I started to say sorry, but she put her hand up. "I'm not fussing at you. You didn't know about any of this. This is on me. I ought to have told you, but I didn't. I never in my life figured out how to say it to somebody without sounding like I needed to be thrown in a home." "So, what is it?" "I don't know." "Aunt Julie." "Weasel, I've been in this house 51 years and I do not know. Don't sit there and look at me like I'm keeping it from you." "Well, where'd it come from?" "It was here when we got married." She cleared her throat. "Earl's mother kept it. His grandmother before her. I never asked past that, and I didn't want to know past that. If you're fixing to ask me why, it's because there's no end to that road." "So, Uncle Earl knew about it?" She nodded. "And he still lived here?" "Well, he was born here," she said. "What does it want?" "Not much. It wants let out, to be left alone, and it wants kept nice. You gotta keep her dusted, and you leave that back door off the hook so it can go outside. But you never put your hands on her. Treat her right, and she'll walk her rounds and she won't bother a soul." "That's it?" "That's it, 4 years at a time." I didn't like the sound of that. "What do you mean? What about the rest of the time?" "It'll take what it needs when it needs it, and you don't get any say. All you get a say in is whether you're decent about it after." "Aunt Julie, I don't know what that means." "No, you don't, and you don't need to." She got up. "It means Joyce was 6 years old and healthy in 1974. Then she took the milk I hadn't touched and poured it in the sink. She said we needed to get the mower out and get the yard mowed before it got too hot. That is every word my great Aunt Julie ever said to me about it, and now I'm telling it to you. She never brought it up again for as long as I knew her, and I never dared to ask her another thing. We moved to that rental house, just as planned. Life went back to normal as life without a dad could be. My mom went to her grave just 2 years ago, and I never did tell her. This next part might be funny. You might think I was scared of my Aunt Julie's place, or even of her after what happened to me. But no, we met up at her place several times a year for Christmases, Thanksgiving, and all that. It was fun and wholesome as it should be, and she was always her old self. The only change would be that I never, ever dared set foot in that front room. But Aunt Julie started to slip around 2012. She forgot names first, then the rest of it. By 2019, we couldn't keep her out there, so she went to a home over in town. My mother sold the house that fall to a family from out of state who were tickled to death to get 11 acres at that price. Julie had a bad time at dusk. That's common, they told us. Around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, she would get agitated and want to go home, no idea where she was, and that kept happening every day until she couldn't talk anymore. But before that time came, she would often get a hold of your wrist and ask you, "Did you let the dog out?" The nurses thought it was the sweetest thing in the world. They would say, "Oh yes, ma'am, don't worry about it. The dog's been let out." And she would settle right down. One of them mentioned to my mother that she pictured Julie as a young woman with a big, beautiful dog running in a field. My mother said thank you, and that was right. But all I could do was just stare at the floor. There was one time she grabbed my wrists, and when she did, she didn't even look at me. She looked at the window nearby, and what she said was, "Longhead's out. Somebody's got to let Longhead back in." After Aunt Julie passed, at some point I asked my mother, what happened to Joyce? Mom said it went with the house. The buyers had even asked about it, actually. Thought it was some period piece. Asked if it conveyed. So they got it. It's still standing in that window now. It's been decades as of writing this. I drove out there not too long ago, just to take a look and pass by. I slowed at the end of the track, and I looked. The pecan trees had been cut back, and there was a swing set in the yard. There was also a dog in the yard, some kind of German Shepherd mix. It was big and young, running along the fence, chasing something. Then I pulled away, and I drove home. I'm a big fan of this story. There's something so cozy yet disturbing about it at the same time. If I was the type to listen to my own stuff, this would be one of the stories I come back to on a rainy day. Let me ask you all this. Would you like your own Longhead? Which breed would you prefer? And would you make sure to take care of it? Good night. Thank you all so much for tuning in to this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. Follow me on X at Dark Prevails for announcements and other cool stuff. Send me your own stories of the unexplained over at darkstories.org. Support the show and what I do by going to erie.fm/premium and sign up to be a premium member to unlock audiobooks, bonus stories, and much more, plus no ads on any of your favorite EerieCast shows. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one. I can't wait, because mine and Carmen Carrion's new book, Freaky Folklore, Terrifying Tales of the World's Most Elusive Monsters and Enigmatic Cryptids, is coming July 16th, featuring the history and lore of terrifying folklore creatures from across the globe, alongside some cool and creepy illustrations. Pre-order today on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or your favorite bookstore, or go to eriecast.com/freak. The next 1,000 verified pre-orders will get a Freaky Folklore decal and a 3-month subscription code to EerieCast Plus, and all entrants will get a free PDF sneak peek of the Freaky Folklore book. To verify and for more info, go to eriecast.com/freak. Send your scariest workplace stories to us at eriecast.com/submit, and rate and review Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Papers, please. No, I don't want your receipt, you goofball. I'm talking about your traveling papers, because today I've got some delightfully juicy Border Patrol stories to share with you. We already know that crazy and often scary things happen at the border, north or south. But what you didn't know is just how absolutely weird it gets out there. Believe these stories or not, but do make sure to enjoy your coffee. These are tales from the break room. He never came back. From Darderton. I worked as a border patrol agent for several years before taking a desk job instead. It was a tough job. Long hours and often unforgiving conditions. Not to mention, it seems like nobody likes you for what you do. You also saw a lot of things out there in the desert. Things that can shake even the most seasoned agent. But there was one series of events, one particular partner, that I'll never forget. It's a story I don't tell often, but when I do, people tend to look at me a little differently afterwards. The ones that believe me look at the desert a little differently too. About 5 years ago, I was stationed down near the border in one of the most remote stretches of our patrol area. It was the kind of place where the night sky is so clear, you feel like you can reach out and touch the stars. But that kind of clarity also brings a sort of emptiness with it. I just feel like it can play tricks on your mind, make you see and hear things that aren't there. Or maybe they are there, maybe we're just not equipped to understand it. My partner at the time was a guy I'll call Mike. He was a few years younger than me, still relatively new to the job. But Mike was sharp, and he had good instincts. We got along well too, which meant a lot for this job. We passed the long nights with idle chatter and some bad jokes. It was on one of those night patrols that things started to get strange. We were driving along the border fence, scanning the darkness with our spotlight, when Mike suddenly went rigid. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice tense. I turned down the crackly radio. Hear what?" "That whistling. It sounded close, like it was coming from just on the other side of the fence." I listened hard, but all I could hear was the hum of the engine and the wind whistling past our SUV. "I don't hear a thing. Maybe you heard the wind." Mike shook his head. "No, it was different. It sounded, I don't know, human." We sat in silence for a few minutes, straining our ears. But the night remained quiet beyond our vehicle, undisturbed. Finally, Mike sighed and leaned back in his seat. Maybe you're right. Things just feel weird out here sometimes." A few nights later, it happened again. This time we were out on foot, checking a sensor which had been tripped near a known smuggling route. As we hiked through the scrubby brush, I heard it. A clear, melodic whistle. Reminded me of a bird call, but not quite. It was coming from a stand of trees about 50 yards to our left. I glanced at Mike and saw him frozen there, his hand on his sidearm. He met my eyes, and I could see the same unease that I felt reflected back at me. Without a word, we changed course, moving cautiously towards this sound. As we got closer, the whistling stopped. The night was suddenly eerily silent. Even the usual chorus of insects and night birds had gone quiet. We switched on our flashlights, sweeping the beams over the gnarled trunks and spiny undergrowth. We then saw something. Just for a second, at the very edge of the light, a figure, pale and unnaturally thin, darting between the trees. Whatever it was, whoever it was, they were there and gone so fast, I nearly convinced myself I had imagined it. But then I heard Mike's sharp intake of breath. "Did you see that?" His voice was barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. We pressed forward, more urgently now. But no matter how quickly we moved, the figure and its noises seemed to stay just ahead of us, its form flitting in and out of sight, like some sort of ghost. The whole time that eerie whistling wound through the trees, also always seeming to come from just ahead of us. Eventually, we burst into a small clearing and stopped dead. There in the center of the open space was a perfect circle of stones. They had been arranged way too neatly to be natural, each one placed with obvious intention. In the center of that circle, the dirt had been disturbed, like something had been buried there. We looked at one another, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Neither of us were superstitious men, but there was definitely something about that circle, about the whole night even, that felt wrong. To me, it was like we had intruded on something we weren't supposed to see. Without a word, we backed out of the clearing and returned to the SUV. We didn't talk about what we'd seen. Not on the drive back, not in the locker room as we changed out of our uniforms. But I could tell it was weighing on Mike. He was quieter on our patrols after that, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows. A few weeks went by without incident. We started to relax, convincing ourselves it had just been a weird night, a trick of the light and the mind. But then we got a call. A sensor had been tripped out in the desert. It wasn't far from where we'd seen the stone circle. That shift, when the sensors were nearby, we were taking turns going to check it out alone, because most of the sensors there didn't allow travel by SUV, not unless you wanted to risk tearing up the vehicle and getting written up for it. So it was Mike's turn to check it out. He gave me a long look as he climbed out of the SUV, like he wanted to say something, but in the end, he just shook his head and trudged off into the night, his flashlight bobbing in the darkness. I waited for him to come back. 5 minutes, 10, 15. The radio stayed silent. A feeling of anxiety began to grow in my gut. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear and set off in the direction Mike had gone. When I couldn't find him, I began to call out his name into the night. I found his flashlight first. It was lying in the dirt, still switched on. A few feet away was his radio, followed by his hat. But no sign of Mike. It was like he had simply vanished into the desert. I ran back and called it in, my voice shaking. Within an hour, the area was swarming with agents, search dogs, helicopters. But as the night wore on and the sun rose, there was still no trace of Mike. It was like the desert swallowed him whole. The official report said that he must have gotten disoriented, that he wandered off, got lost. But I knew Mike. I knew he wasn't the type to just wander off, and I couldn't shake the memory of that pale figure we'd seen in the trees and that perfect circle of stones. It wasn't until a few days later that they found it. Mike's belt, coiled neatly on a rock about a mile from where he disappeared. And sitting on top of it, glinting in the sun, were two small metal objects. I saw the pictures. Took me a moment to recognize them. Tooth fillings. Both of Mike's tooth fillings. I knew for sure then Mike hadn't simply disappeared. He was taken. And a feeling deep inside of me, one that I couldn't talk about, said that Mike had been taken by something not so human. Possibly the same thing responsible for the circle of stones. A normal animal wouldn't just pluck the fillings from a man's teeth and neatly arrange his belt around a rock. This was something else. Something that I can't explain, can't understand. It didn't take me long after that to transfer out of the sector. I took a desk job instead, spent more time with my family. But I've never forgotten that night, and I never did stop wondering what really happened to Mike out there in the desert. It kills me inside, thinking that Mike is now just another ghost story. A real man with real feelings, his own family, now just a legend that agents tell each other about the worst that can happen out there. If you live close to the border, or heck, you work at the border like I used to, be mindful of your eyes and ears. and don't go chasing ghosts in the dark, especially alone. Border Patrol Ghost Story from A Line at a Time. It was another long night shift at the border. I remember sitting in the state-issued SUV with two other officers. I'll call them Jim and Terry. We were parked on a remote stretch of the border, miles from the nearest town, watching and waiting, which is what we do most nights, sitting for hours, scanning the darkness with night vision goggles, looking for any signs of movement. Jim and Terry were good guys, easy to work with. Jim was about my age, mid-30s, with a wife and two young kids at home. Terry was an older dude, in his late 50s. He'd been on the job longer than Jim and I combined. We often passed the time on these long nights by swapping stories. It was the typical stuff most of the time. Funny arrests, crazy chases, bureaucratic nonsense. But on that night, Terry was quiet. He seemed lost in thought. He was just staring out into the dark. "You all right there, Terry?" Jim asked, noticing the man's silence. Terry snapped to attention. He looked at me and then to Jim, like he was about to say something. "You boys ever hear any strange stories about this stretch of the border?" he asked, his voice serious. Jim and I exchanged a look. We had heard the usual rumors and urban legends that circulate among Border Patrol agents. Tales of drug runners and human traffickers, and the occasional ghost story. But something in Terry's tone suggested this was different. "What kind of stories do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. Terry was quiet for a moment. Then, with a heavy sigh, he started to speak. "This was about 20 years ago, when I was a rookie agent. I was paired up with this older officer, Garcia. Tough as nails he was, didn't say much. He'd been on the job for decades, I think, had seen it all. We were out on patrol one night, not far from here. It was a night just like this. Quiet, dark, not a soul around. We had been sitting for hours and I was starting to nod off. And that's when Garcia suddenly sat up straight, grabbing his goggles. "You see that?" he asked me, his voice all tense. I looked where he was pointing, but I didn't see anything. It was just empty desert. But Garcia insisted. He said he saw a figure, a man walking out there in the dark. He got out of the SUV, began to walk out into the desert. I called after him, but he ignored me and kept going. So I had no choice but to follow him. We walked together for maybe 10 minutes, but Garcia was always a few steps ahead of me. I kept asking him what he saw, but he just wouldn't answer. And then, all of a sudden, he stopped. Dead still, like he'd hit an invisible wall. I caught up to him, and that's when I saw it too. About 50 yards ahead of us, there was a man. At least I think it was a man. It was hard to tell. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked to be an old-fashioned suit, like something out of the 1800s. And he just stood there, in the middle of the desert, not moving. I began to call out to him, but Garcia grabbed me by the arm. His grip was like iron. "Don't," he said. And there was real fear in that voice. I'd never heard him sound like that before. Then the figure started to move. And I'm not saying he walked. He glided across the ground. And he was coming straight for us. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Every instinct in me was telling me to run. But I was frozen. The figure got closer and closer, and I could see its face now. Decrepit. Old. Older than any man should be. Garcia was the first to move, and when he finally unfroze, that thing was only a few feet away from us. He yanked me by the arm hard, pulling me back the way we came. We ran, stumbling through the dark, not looking back. We didn't stop until we made it back to the SUV. Garcia was shaken as he started the engine. I remember that part. We didn't speak the whole drive back to the station, but just before we got out of the SUV, Garcia turned to me. "You didn't see anything out here tonight," he said. It wasn't a question, it was an order. "We didn't see anything. Understand?" I nodded, too shaken to argue, and that was the last we ever spoke of it. Garcia retired a year later. Unrelated, I think, just health issues, but it did make me wonder. I tried to put it out of my mind, convincing myself it was a trick of the light, maybe even fatigue or tiredness, but I never quite could. Not fully. And over the years, I've heard other stories too. Other agents having similar experiences out here, always at night, always the same stretch of desert. They say it's a ghost, the spirit of some poor soul who died out here a long time back. Maybe a migrant, maybe a settler, who knows, but something keeps it here, making it wander these sands. And sometimes, just sometimes when the night is dark and the desert is quiet, it appears to the unlucky few who happen to cross it. Terry fell silent, his story finished. Jim and I sat there, not quite knowing what to say about it. The desert outside the vehicle suddenly seemed a lot darker, a lot more threatening. "Terry, are you just trying to freak us out? Did you really see something like that?" Jim asked. Terry just nodded. "As clear as I see you now, and I pray every night I never see it again." We didn't talk much after that. Each of us were lost in our own thoughts, just staring out into the night with a new sense of fear, thanks to Terry. I've been on countless patrols since that night, but every time I'm out there in this particular stretch of border, I can't help but think about Terry's story. I do find myself looking out into the dark a little more intently, my heart beating a little faster when I do see some shadows or hear an unexpected sound. I can't help but think about Terry's story. A part of me hopes I never will, but there is another part of me that wonders how true his story was and how many of the other agents have similar tales. Out here after dark in the desert, feels like anything could happen at any time. What happens along Canada? From Cooper Trooper. The life of a Border Patrol agent can be pretty lonely, especially when you're stationed along the US-Canadian border. The job requires you to be alert, patient, and okay with being alone for long whiles. But even for those of us who are used to the long stretches of quiet, there are moments that really shake us up, the kind of stuff that makes you question what's real and what's not. You can call me Alex, and as you could probably guess by now, I work as a Border Patrol agent. I'm stationed at a rather remote outpost in the dense forests of northern Minnesota, right next to the Canadian border. It's a beautiful location, with tall pines, clear lakes, and lots of wildlife. But it's also a place where the line between natural and supernatural apparently can get pretty blurry, and this story will tell you why I think that. Before this, I've always been skeptical about paranormal stuff. I've heard a story here and there from some of the other guys about strange lights in the sky or weird noises at night. Heck, I've even heard of Sasquatch sightings up here. But I always thought they were just people's imaginations running wild in the dark. Anyway, this happened October 13th of 2023. It was a crisp autumn evening. I was halfway through my usual 12-hour shift. That night was moonless if I recall correctly. The stars were hidden by thick clouds anyway. I was driving along a lonely stretch of road, headlights cutting through the darkness as I looked for signs of activity along the tree line. To pass the time, I would occasionally chat with my friend Tom over the radio, who was hardly at work back at the station. He was about 20 miles east of me. We would often swap stories to keep each other awake during the long, boring hours.
Yo, Alex, did you hear about that strange light they spotted near Eli last week?
His voice crackled over the radio. I laughed. Hey, Tom, let me guess. A UFO sighting.
Maybe, but no. This one was a bit different. From what I heard, it was a huge pulsing ball of light that just hovered over the trees for a few minutes before disappearing. They say some hikers got it on video, but I haven't seen it yet.
Sounds like a weather balloon to me, I said. There's my old skepticism kicking in.
Yeah, probably,
Tom agreed, but I don't think he sounded totally convinced. We were quiet for a while after that. Each of us focused on our own tasks. I kinda felt guilty, thinking maybe I was a buzzkill, with my instant explanation to the supposed paranormal phenomenon. That night seemed to drag on forever. After Tom went quiet, I quickly became bored. I remember just thinking about plans for the next week, when something happened. It started with a low, throbbing hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. At first, I thought it was my vehicle's engine acting up, but as the sound grew louder and more intense, I realized it was coming from somewhere else. I slowed to a stop, my heart racing as I scanned the trees for any movement. But the humming was getting louder now, and I didn't see any source. At that point, I could feel it vibrating in my bones, making my teeth chatter. And then, in an instant, the night exploded into blinding, searing light. It was like someone had flipped a switch, turning the dark night into a harsh, unforgiving whiteness that seemed to burn right through my eyes. I even threw my arm up to shield my face, squinting against the glare. My mind was racing, trying to explain what was happening. The light was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, a pulsing, throbbing brilliance. But it didn't seem to have a source. Let me just drill this home. It was the middle of the night and bright as the midday sun. Weirder yet, it didn't cast any shadows. The trees, the road, even the sky itself seemed to have been bleached of all their color, turned into a flat, featureless void. I then fumbled for the radio, my hands shaking as I tried to reach Tom. Hey Tom, do you copy? Are you seeing this? But my voice seemed small and far away, drowned out by the constant thrum of the light. I didn't get a response. There was only hissing static that seemed to get louder with each passing second. I felt a panic in my chest. I was then reminded I was completely alone, and the calm night had suddenly gone crazy. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. It just flicked right off. I was plunged instantly back into darkness. The sudden absence of the light left me temporarily blinded. I blinked rapidly, and eventually my eyes adjusted again. I sat there so confused. What in the world just happened? The humming was gone too, replaced by a very complete silence, which was almost deafening. Besides that, the night had returned to its natural state. The stars were visible again through the gaps in the clouds. But something was different. I could tell, and I don't think it was my remaining panic or paranoia. The air felt electric, as if that phenomenon had affected the very air around me. As I sat there, I tried to calm my racing heart, but I couldn't shake the feeling I had just witnessed something truly incredible, something that I still could not explain. Still shaking, I reached for the radio, and I tried Tom again. Tom, are you there? Did you see that? Still, no response. More crackling static, and just my own heavy breathing. So I sat still for a while, trying to make sense of it and wondering what in the world I should do next. But then I began to hear something else. This was a deep, low rumble, like if the earth itself had become a sleeping beast. It was coming from the depths of the forest. It seemed to vibrate everything around me and everything in me. My teeth, my spine, my brain. For a moment, I hesitated. I wanted to kick it into gear and drive away, get away from that place. But also, I wanted to investigate. I was Border Patrol, and it was my job to confront any potential threats, no matter how strange or unexpected. But something about that sound filled me with a sense of dread. I was scared, and I couldn't quite explain it. Still, I knew I couldn't just sit there. I had to make a choice. One more time I reached for the radio, the shake in my voice increasing. "Dispatch, this is Alex. I'm hearing a strange noise coming from the woods, about a mile north of my current location. I'm gonna go check it out. Might need backup." Of course, no response. I then stepped out of my vehicle, my hand resting on my gun just in case. The night was very cold, very damp. The smell of pine and earth was very thick. I clicked on my flashlight. Step by step, I made my way into the forest, the rumbling sound growing louder and louder each passing moment. But I could tell it was coming from somewhere up ahead, deep within that tangled maze of trees and undergrowth that I could see. As I walked, I noticed something else, a pulsating light. Something in the distance was flickering, like a strobe. It was this sickly greenish-yellow color. The closer I got, the more intense it became, until it seemed to fill the entire forest with an eerie glow. And then a smell hit me. A sharp, acrid odor, like sulfur mixed with something else, something rotten and decaying. It filled my nose and mouth, making me gag and cough. I had to pull my shirt up over my nose, trying to block it out, but it seemed to seep into my pores, clinging to my skin. This morbid curiosity kept me going. The rumbling was deafening now, the light blinding. I was just about to break through the tree line, into what appeared to be a clearing where the light might be coming from, when it happened. There was a sudden, searing pain exploding in my head, like a white-hot knife being driven right into my skull. I remember clearly screaming at the top of my lungs and falling to my knees in agony. I kid you not, this was the worst pain I've ever felt. Like, imagine your brain being ripped apart from the inside. But then, I just remember waking up. I had apparently passed out. But when I came to, I was by my vehicle again. How I'd gotten there, unconsciously, I have no idea. My vision was a bit blurry as I tried to get up. The rumbling sound had stopped. There was no more pulsating light. Everything was silent, except for the distant hooting of an owl. My headache was completely gone, too. I looked around. When I first saw that I was next to my vehicle, my blood ran cold. I could hear from the ground outside. The radio was going crazy, a jumble of voices and static blaring from my speakers.
"Alex, do you copy? What's your status? Need backup at the northern perimeter. Strange lights reported in."
I staggered to my feet. How did I get here? I thought. What even happened in the woods? I then felt something warm and sticky on my upper lip. I reached up, and my fingers touched it. When I pulled them away, I saw that they were covered with blood. Blood that had poured from my nose all over my uniform. I fumbled for my phone, intending to call for help, but when I pulled it out of my pocket, I was even more confused and shocked. The screen was flashing. My phone was factory resetting itself. All my data, my contacts, my photos, everything had been gone. Who did that? How did that happen? Am I crazy? Have any of you ever had your phone just factory reset out of nowhere? I stood there just so freaked out. I didn't know what to do. In the end, I did the only thing I could do. I stumbled back into the vehicle, my hands trembling, and I took a deep breath. I tried to calm myself, and I pulled away, driving back to the nearest station, where I made a report of what I saw and got medical care. Luckily, X-rays and CT scans didn't find anything wrong with me. Tom believed my story, but I can't say the same about my other coworkers. I did take a day off, so that was nice, but it was hard to enjoy after experiencing something like that. So, in the end, what do you think it was? Some sort of weird UFO event? Maybe an asteroid or meteor with some sort of EMF that was strong enough to mess up my brain? And my phone? And what, did it get up and carry me back to my vehicle? I don't know. I just don't know. Old Dog Man Tales from West Goodland. Let me tell you some stories from back in my days with the CBSA, the Canada Border Services Agency. I personally spent most of my career either behind a desk, going through reports, or patrolling the forests along the border, keeping an eye out for drug mules and whatnot. It was a pretty quiet job most of the time, but every now and then, you would hear some stories that might make your skin crawl. This set of stories in particular regards a certain type of that my coworkers cited on multiple occasions. I remember one time sitting around the office with some of the other agents. We were shooting the breeze near the end of the day. One of the older guys, named Lewis, starts telling us about this weird thing he saw out in the woods. He said he'd been hearing stories about this creature for years, but he never really believed them. Not until he saw it himself. Here's how it went down according to him. Lewis was out on patrol in his vehicle one night, driving along a road that runs parallel to the border for several miles. It was pretty late, and he wasn't expecting to see anyone out there. But then, up ahead, he spots this van parked on the side of the road. He drives by it real slow, takes a look at it. He can see the tops of a couple of heads. Looks like a couple of folks either hiding or sleeping. Lewis wasn't sure if he wanted to investigate this. If it was just some people sleeping, it was a pretty common sight, especially for those who got lost on the road, mainly tourists and such. About 50 yards away from the van, he stops, pulls over, and decides he should check it out, just to be safe. He walks down to the van, enjoying the walk because he said the breeze felt nice. As he walks up to the driver's side window, he gets a better look at the inside. There is a couple in there, but they're not hiding. They both seem to be sleeping. Even so, he taps on the window. The guy inside wakes up startled. The man shifts around to get up, waking up the woman he's with. The guy rolls down the window, and Lewis asks, "Border Service, everything all right here?" The guy starts to explain they've been driving for hours, and they were just too tired to keep going. Apparently, they were from Michigan, on a little romantic road trip, but they were having trouble reading their map. They didn't know where the nearest gas station actually was, nor any motels. So they figured they would just pull over and catch a few winks. Now, Lewis is a pretty understanding guy. He tells them that's no problem, but they shouldn't be parking out here like this. He begins to explain some directions for them to the nearest town, when all of a sudden, he hears this loud snap behind him. The couple in the van look right past him, eyes wide and freaked out, so Lewis spins around to take a look. There on the other side of the road, he sees this thing standing there. At first, he thinks it's a bear or something, but then he realizes it's standing on two legs, and it's much leaner than a bear, and it's tall, like really tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet at least. The thing is just standing there perfectly still, like it's watching them. But Lewis can see it breathing. Lewis says at that point his heart was beating like it never had before. He was trying to figure out what the heck he was even looking at. He can see it was covered in fur, but it was not like any animal he'd ever seen. It had these yellow eyes, and Lewis swears the thing was just boring into his soul with the way it was staring. Lewis just stood there, and the couple kept staring. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Then, as quickly as they saw it, the thing turns and bounds off into the forest. Lewis says at this part of the story, he had never seen a living creature move that fast in his life. It was like it was there 1 second and gone the next, in these huge strides. As you could probably guess, Lewis was really shaken up by then. The couple in the van could tell, and when Lewis turns around to face them again, the guy asks if he'd like a ride back to his vehicle before they head off. Now, it was only 50 yards or so, but Lewis was not too keen on walking back there alone after seeing that. So he takes them up on their offer, even though it's probably against some protocol, and he hops in the van. They drive him back to his vehicle. Lewis thanks them for the help, giving them a quick refresher about his directions, and they part ways. Lewis gets in his car and drives back to the office. When Lewis told us this story the first time, we were all pretty skeptical. I mean, a giant furry creature, walking on 2 legs. Sounds like a scary movie. But then a few of the other guys started to chime in, saying that they've heard similar stories over the years. That was the day that I realized this thing had been spotted all over the forests here, always at night too. Some folks called it a dogman, saying it was similar to the thing people claim to see in Michigan, in the US. Others say it's a wendigo. But really, nobody knew for sure what it was. All I knew was, after hearing Lewis's story, I started to pay more attention when I was out on patrol. I'd be lying to you if I said I didn't get a little jumpy every time I heard a twig snap or saw a shadow move in the trees. But that was part of my job, I guess. When you spend as much time in the woods as we did, you're bound to see some strange things out there, or at least hear them. And from the sounds of it, sounds like there's nothing quite as strange as coming face to face with a creature that's not meant to exist. That's just one of my stories from my time with the CBSA, one of the ones that stuck with me, probably because it was the first time I really began to believe that maybe there was something out there, something that we can't explain. Fast forward a few years from that, I was sitting in the break room with some of the newer recruits. We were swapping stories about the weird things we've seen out in the woods. One of the guys, not one of the new ones, Gene, starts telling us about this encounter he had only a few months ago. Gene was out on patrol one night. He gets a call about some underage kids who got caught trying to smuggle cases of booze across the border. He catches up to them, pulls them over, and sure enough, the car is full of beer and liquor, and they were years away from being legal. So he loads the kids into the back of his cruiser. He starts to head back to the station. He's giving them the usual lecture about how this is going to go on their permanent record and how they're lucky they didn't get caught by the American side, which is said to be much harsher. Then, all of a sudden, the kids start to scream bloody murder from the back seat. Gene, who had been glancing on and off at the rearview mirror as he talked, slammed on the brakes, startled. He looks up just in time to see this massive, hairy figure taking a step off the road and into the trees. He says it had to be about 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It was walking on 2 legs, like a person. For a second, Gene just sits there, wondering what in the world he just saw. He could hear the kids in the back, cursing, freaked out, and also excited, saying things like, "Dude, no way that was real." Gene couldn't agree with the kid, because he knew what he just saw, and he was beyond scared. Gene was just about to pull away when the back end of his cruiser suddenly dipped down. It was like something heavy just sat on the trunk. The kids start to scream again. Gene whips around to take a look at what's going on. There, pressed up against the back window, are these 2 glowing yellow eyes staring right at them. Gene says the thing had the snout of a dog. but it was far too big to be any kind of dog he'd ever seen. It had pointed ears like a wolf or something. But the really scary part was that it wasn't alone. As Gene's just sitting there, frozen in fear, he sees another set of eyes, just behind the first one. There were two of these things behind his car. Whatever they were both just looking at them, as if curious, or maybe wanting to get inside. He says he didn't know what to do. I don't think anyone knows what to do in that situation. He was armed, of course, but he wasn't about to start shooting at these things from the inside of the vehicle, not with the kids in the back. So he did the only thing he could think to do. He floored it. Says he must have went about 100 miles an hour, tearing down that dark, empty road, the idea of those things chasing after him in his head, though he doubts they actually were. The kids were screaming, not really sure if they were thrilled or terrified at his driving. He was really just praying that he could make it back to the station and not have to see anything else like that for the remainder of the night. Eventually, he sees the lights of the station up ahead. He pulls into the parking lot, tires squealing, and jumps out of the car, quickly getting those teenagers out and into the building. As he looked back right before going inside, he saw that the road was empty and the woods were quiet, as they should be. Gene says he didn't tell anyone what happened at first. He was way too creeped out and confused. A couple years later, he heard another story from a different agent, a similar one, and he decided to finally share his. It really helps you open up when you realize you may not be as crazy as you once thought. When Gene shared that story, the whole break room went quiet, but then more people began to open up. The more we talked, the more stories began to come out of the woodwork. Not every agent saw something like this, but they did have eerie things that they couldn't explain happen. For example, some of those guys claimed they'd seen things running alongside their cars, keeping pace at high speeds. Others said they'd found weird footprints in the snow, tracks that looked about 2 to 3 times bigger than a wolf's. Then there were the really wild stories. The ones that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Well, either that, or made you laugh. Those were the ones I have trouble believing. Like the one from the agent who swore he saw these things rip a deer apart with their bare claws. Or the guy who claimed he'd been chased through the woods by a whole pack of them. Now, I definitely don't believe every one of these stories, especially the crazier ones like those. After all, there are some guys who just want to be a part of the crowd. But I'm not the end-all be-all of the truth. For all I know, all those stories were true in some way. This brings me to one more story that I've got for you. This one might be the creepiest of them all. It happened to a friend of mine, an agent who was working at one of those remote border stations, the kind that's miles away from anywhere and only staffed by a handful of people. It was late one night when my friend, Cheyenne, was working the graveyard shift with just one other lady. They were both sitting in the office just catching up on paperwork, trying to stay awake too, downing way too much coffee, as you do on those kinds of nights. That's when Cheyenne begins to hear these strange noises coming from outside. At first, she thinks it's the wind, maybe a raccoon or something. But as she listens closer, she realizes it sounds more like sniffing, like something is literally pressing its nose up against the walls of the building outside, taking deep breaths. She tries to ignore it and focus on her work, but the noises are getting louder and more persistent. After about 20 minutes of this, they stop altogether. She breathes a sigh of relief, then goes back to her paperwork, figuring whatever it was must have lost interest and wandered off. But then, about half an hour later, all hell breaks loose. Out of nowhere, this blood-curdling howl erupts from just outside the building. It was so loud somehow, so close, it makes the windows rattle. Cheyenne jumps out of her chair, covers her ears, and looks over at her coworker. who was white as a sheet. And then, before either of them could say a word, 2 more howls answered the first, coming from the opposite side of the office. It was like they were surrounded, like whatever was out there had them completely boxed in. Cheyenne's mind was racing, trying her best to figure out what in the world was making those sounds. She knew that there were wolves in the area, but this was something different. It sounded bigger, stronger than any wolf she had heard. And that's when things got really weird. She began to hear this scratching sound like claws on metal coming from the wall behind her desk. She turned around slowly, her eyes wide with fear. Because here's the thing. These clawing sounds were coming about 8 feet off the ground, way higher than any normal animal around these parts could reach. Sure, it could be a bear, but bears don't howl. For the next 20 minutes or so, Cheyenne and her coworkers sat there in terror, listening to the scratching, the sniffing, the howls, wondering what in God's name was out there with them and what they wanted. After what felt like forever, the noises began to fade away. She guessed whatever it was had finally given up and moved on. She and her coworkers sat there for a while, wordlessly. They were seriously too scared to move. She says it felt like if she moved or made too much noise, those things might come back. Think about that. Has anything scared you enough to instill prey-like thoughts in your head? When the next shift arrived, she went out to take a look. There were these deep claw marks gouged into the walls of the building on the outside. Marks that no coyote or wolf could have made. They were a bit too deep, too broad, too high up off the ground. The clincher, though. Cheyenne swears she could even smell the things that had been out there. There was this heavy, musky odor, a sort of stench she had never encountered around these parts before. And there you have it, the best 3 stories I've heard about the dog man cited by the CBSA. It's just so crazy that I feel like I'm just scratching the surface here about all the weird and unexplainable things that some of the agents have seen along the Canadian border. As for those dog-man creatures, I wonder what they are. Mutated wolves? The missing link? Could be something even weirder, like some sort of furry alien. Truth is, I've got no idea. But after 30 years on the job, I've learned to keep an open mind. And at this point, I think I do believe that there's some sort of werewolf, dogman type thing out there. Or at least something that looks like one. But hey, that's just one old agent's opinion. Take it for what it's worth. The Immigrant's Story. From Stuff Joseph Says. It was a scorching hot day out in the desert. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and dance like it's alive. I was doing my routes along the border when I run up on what appears to be an illegal immigrant with an injured leg. He's limping his way along and frowns when he sees me. He's in rough shape, his leg all twisted at a weird angle, his face pale with pain too. Looks like he had come a long way. I radio for help, and I carefully pull over and make my way out to him. The gravel there was pretty loose, and I try not to lose my footing. I ask him some questions. He was luckily bilingual, and admits he had crossed the border, stating that he's a Mexican citizen. I asked him where he thought he was going, and he said that he had some family out in New Mexico. He didn't have any papers, but I wasn't too worried about that just yet. Illegal or not, this guy needed some medical attention, and part of my job was to make sure he got it. I help him, half carrying, half dragging him back to my vehicle. It was slow going, but eventually we made it. I got him settled in the back seat and propped his torn up leg on a blanket. I started the long drive back to the nearest Border Patrol station. M was quiet at first, likely disappointed and scared. When you cross the border illegally and an agent finds you, Guys like this are usually thinking when they're going to be sent back, and whether or not they're going to make that long journey again, just to be sent back once more. Now, in all honesty, that's not the case for everyone. These days, many of these folks are just let in and given court dates, and as long as they show back up for court, they're often able to stay here for long periods of time until they get citizenship. After a while, he starts to relax a bit. The two of us get to talking. I ask him about his family in New Mexico. He says that's all the family he has left. His wife had just passed away, and he had nothing to his name. He had some kids, but they died in childhood, sadly. We keep driving for several more minutes. Eventually, the conversation turns to how the journey was, how tough it might have been, the things he saw out there. Then I see him smile, and he begins to open up with a story. I've heard my fair share of weird stories over the years, but what M tells me next sends a chill down my spine and a smile across my face. It was both eerie and a bit wholesome. M said that a few nights back, he was trying to sleep out in the open, covered only by a tarp he'd brought with him. That's when a man suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The guy came right up and just sat down on a nearby rock. He was a gringo, M says, wearing old worn-out clothes with a big bushy beard. At first, the man just sat there, sipping at a dark brown bottle, which M assumed was alcohol. He sat up, eyeing the man warily, wondering what he wanted and how he had managed to sneak up on him like that. The gringo spoke. He asked him where he was going. His voice was low and gravelly. M hesitated for a moment, not sure if he should answer at all. But something about the man's calm, steady gaze made him feel like he could trust him. "To my family," M said, "in New Mexico." The man smiled at him, then took another swig from his bottle. He cleared his throat, and when he started to speak again, he went straight away giving M directions. And M says the man's voice took on a strange, almost hypnotic quality. He told the immigrant exactly where to go, which paths to take, which ones to avoid. Then, almost as an afterthought, he warned M about the pit, a deep and treacherous drop-off in the ground that he needed to steer clear of at all costs. M listened carefully, committing the man's words to memory. And just as suddenly as he'd appeared, the man stood up, walked off into the distance, and as his figure grew smaller and smaller, M blinked and he vanished. M really focused on this part, describing that the man didn't just fade away in the distance. Rather, his figure was gone in the blink of an eye, and yet there was nothing nearby the man for him to hide behind to disappear like that. There was just no sign of him anymore. This weirded him out, but he went back to sleep, needing the energy for the rest of the journey. Come morning, he packed up his tarp and his water and set out again, following the directions the man had given him, because otherwise he really had nothing to go on. Then the strangeness of the night turned into a miracle, because the path the man gave him led him straight to a gap in the border fence, a narrow opening that he never would have found on his own. M squeezed through, more excited than ever. He started to make his way across the desert on the other side. But then, just as he was starting to think he might actually make it, he hit a patch of loose gravel and lost his footing. He tumbled down into a ditch, his leg twisting underneath him with a sickening crunch. M explains he was actually lucky. It could have been much worse. I glanced back at him and asked how. Well, supposedly, just a few feet away from where he'd fallen, there was a steep, jagged drop-off, so deep and sudden, he never would have seen it coming. If he had taken just a few more steps over, he would have gone tumbling over that edge, and that would have been the end of him. As I listened to his story, I got goosebumps. I'd heard plenty of strange stories over the years, yeah, but this was different. It was like the man had known what was going to happen, like he'd been looking out for Im somehow. Makes me wonder, who was that guy? Just some random gringo, out wandering the desert for kicks? Or was he something more than that? I emptied my thoughts and just focused on driving back to the station. Im got the medical attention he needed. And as far as I know after that, Im actually made it to his family in New Mexico, and he's well on his way to citizenship. All of this just goes to show you, the desert is one weird place. Thanks for tuning in to Tales from the Break Room, the home of the scariest true work stories. If you want to hear your story narrated by me, send it to me at eeriecast.com/submit. We pay 5 cents per word for accepted stories. Help us grow by leaving Tales from the Break Room a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app. Check out eeriecast.com or search for EerieCast on those very same podcast apps to see our other exciting and terrifying podcasts, like Unexplained Encounters, the other show I host, where I read stories with a focus on the supernatural. To get some merch, go to eeriecast.store. And to unlock ad-free episodes of your favorite EerieCast shows and exclusive audiobooks, go to eeriecast.com/plus and consider signing up for EerieCast Plus. You can follow me on Twitter, I guess it's X now, @DarkPrevails. You can also subscribe to me on YouTube, where I deliver the same content. Just look for Darkness Prevails. Good night. I hope we can share another break sometime soon. My God, get ready, because this story scared even me. It almost made me regret living in the Ozarks. This story is titled Box Fan and was sent to me by a viewer named simply Jeb. In it, he recalls a series of bizarre childhood rules and events at his grandparents' mountain home in the Ozarks, which ultimately led to the most traumatic moment in his life, the moment he realized monsters are real. This is the Unexplained Encounters podcast. I sleep with the fan on every single night, regardless of the reason, no matter the temperature. A box fan runs on the floor next to my bed at full speed. My wife thinks it's a white noise thing, something to help me sleep. She's gotten used to it over the years. She bought me one of those sound machines for Christmas a couple years back. It plays ocean waves and rain and all that stuff, and I thanked her. But I put it in the closet and kept on using the fan. She never asked why, but I'm sure she wondered. I think she could tell by my face that I didn't want to explain. I'm 34 years old. I've slept with a box fan on since I was 11, and I'll probably sleep with one on until the day I die. This is not a comfort thing. At least, not in the way you expect. I've never told anyone the full version of what I'm about to write down. Not even my wife. I've explained parts, yeah, like during a particularly bad night terror that had me standing in the hallway at 3 a.m. with my hands against the wall, like I was bracing for something to hit the house, and my wife found me there, asking what I'd been dreaming about. I didn't remember, I said, but that was a lie. Not too long ago, my grandfather passed away. He was 91 years old, lived a full life, and had been in a wheelchair for the last 12 years. A stroke had taken most of his left side. At the funeral, I was standing by the coffee and those little crustless sandwiches that only exist at church receptions when my cousin Parker walked up, and without any preamble or greeting, he leaned in and said, "You remember that night?" It wasn't a question, and I didn't treat it like one. I simply nodded, and we stood still for a while, until his wife called him over to deal with one of his kids, and that was it. We haven't talked about it since. but I'd be lying if I said it didn't shake something loose. So here it is. My grandfather owned 130 acres in the Ozarks, most of it backed up to Mark Twain National Forest land, in a part of southern Missouri where the nearest grocery store was a 40-minute drive and the nearest hospital was further than that. He had retired from the Missouri Pacific Railroad before I was born, and he spent his days doing whatever he wanted on that land, which mostly meant tinkering with small engines and sitting on his porch, growing tomatoes that he'd give away to anyone who stopped by. He was no farmer, though people sometimes assumed he was. He just had land, and he liked having it, and he kept it the way some men keep their guns, maintained and ready, though ready for what was never entirely clear to me as a child. The house was old, but solid. He and my grandmother had built it in 1961 with money he'd saved from the railroad, and it looked like what it was. A post-war rural home designed by people who valued function but had a limited interest in aesthetics. Single-story, partial basement, wood-paneled walls inside that had darkened over the decades to the color of strong tea. It smelled of coffee grounds and something chemically that I eventually identified as mothballs, which were stuffed into the closets. The porch wrapped around two sides and had a concrete floor that was always gritty underfoot. There were two rocking chairs out there that had worn smooth grooves into the concrete from decades of use. The property itself was mostly open yard around the house, maybe 2 acres of mowed grass, then the tree line on 3 sides. The fourth side was the gravel driveway, a 1/4 mile of loose rock that popped under tires and announced every arrival long before you could see the vehicle. Beyond the driveway was just more trees. A barn sat about 200 yards from the house, listing to the south. It had stayed like that for as long as I'd been alive, as though it had decided 30 years ago how far it was willing to lean and had just committed to it. There was a creek that cut through the back portion of the property, where the woods thickened up, and in the summer it ran shallow enough to wade in, and deep enough in a few spots to sit down in up to your chest. Every summer, my parents sent me and my cousins out there for 2 or 3 weeks. Parker was 2 years older than me, fearless in a stupid way, and I say that with the most love possible. Leia was my age, quiet, and loved reading books more than anything. Sometimes baby Derek would come too. He was Aunt Diane's youngest, maybe 4 or 5 years old during the years I'm talking about, but he was mostly just a background presence, trailing after the rest of us and crying when he couldn't keep up. During the day, that property was the best place on earth. I genuinely believed that. We had the run of the entire 100+ acres, and we used every inch of it. I remember catching crawdads in the creek with our bare hands, racing them on the flat rocks. We explored that barn hundreds of times, which was full of old equipment and barn swallows, and rusty junk that felt like pirate treasure to a 9-year-old. Grandpa even had an old 3-wheeler ATV. Yeah, if you didn't know, you could get a 3-wheeler back then. They were a bit more common than what you might see today, because they were soon considered way too dangerous. But back then he would let Parker drive it around the property while the rest of us clung to the back like it was a mechanical bull. Grandma kept a drawer in the kitchen full of candy too. Off-brand candy though, mostly. Most of it being butterscotch discs and peppermints. But occasionally, if you're lucky, there would be Snickers in there, hidden away specifically for the kids. Those really were the good days. I want to be clear about that. Those days were genuinely wonderful. It was the nights that were different. I've spent a long time trying to articulate exactly how the shift happened each evening, and the best I can describe it is that my grandfather had an internal clock that the rest of us could not see or hear, and around 5 or 6 o'clock every day, it would go off, and he would become a different person. Now hold on there, he didn't get mean, he didn't yell or become harsh. He just sort of went somewhere else inside himself. You could see it in the way he moved. He would straighten up from whatever he was doing, and his eyes would go to the sky like he was reading something written up there in a language meant just for him. His jaw would start to clench repeatedly, and then he would herd all the kids inside. The rule was that we had to be in the house before the first star appeared in the sky. Not before sunset, which would have been reasonable, but before the first star. In June in Missouri, the sun doesn't fully set until around 9 o'clock, but the first stars can show up in the east while the western sky is still pale. And Grandpa knew this. He watched for them every night with a patience that bordered on obsession. He would sit on the porch in his rocking chair and face east, just waiting. And the moment he saw that first pinpoint of light, wherever we were on the property, he wanted us inside. If we were down at the creek, he'd ring the iron bell mounted on the porch post. A real cast iron bell, too, the kind you would see at old schoolhouses, and you could hear it across the entire property. That sound meant now. It did not mean start heading back. It didn't mean get an attitude or argue. It meant get your butt inside. Once inside, the house changed, too. Grandpa would go room to room pulling down the blinds. And these were not typical blinds. Every window in that house had thick, opaque roller shades, the heavy kind that you might find in a dark room or a hospital room where a patient needed total darkness. They were mounted inside the window frames, and when you pulled them down, they sealed the glass almost completely. No light got in, and I suppose more importantly, no light got out. He pulled every single one of them down every single night, without exception, and we were not allowed to raise them or peek behind them until morning. He never explained why. It was simply the rule. And in that house, his rules had the weight of physics. You didn't question gravity, and you didn't question Grandpa. The doors were another thing. He had a deadbolt on every exterior door, which, for a rural house in the middle of nowhere, was already unusual. But the front door also had a chain lock and a sliding barrel bolt that he had installed himself, a heavy steel piece that seated into a bracket that he had lag-bolted directly onto the doorframe. Every night, I'd hear him making his rounds. The back door first, then the side door off the kitchen, then the front. Click, click, thunk, slide. The same order every time. The sounds of the house being sealed. And then there were the fans. Every bedroom had a box fan. The cheap kind you could grab at a hardware store for $12 or so, with plastic blades and a rattling motor, and 3 speed settings that were basically loud, louder, and broken sounding. In the room where the kids slept, a guest room with 2 twin beds and a folding cot, Grandpa would set the fan on a wooden chair between the beds and turn it on high before we went to bed. It roared. It pushed air around that didn't need pushing. The house did have central air conditioning that worked fine. The fan would dry out your eyes and your throat so that by morning you'd wake up feeling like you slept in a kiln. Parker hated it and complained about it every summer. Leia slept with a pillow over her face to block the wind. I would just pull the sheet up to my nose and breathed through the fabric, and I dealt with it. One summer, Parker asked Grandma directly why we had to sleep with the fans on. She said the house got stuffy at night and the fans helped circulate the air. Parker pointed out that the air conditioning was literally running, and Grandma gave him a look that was pleasant on the surface, but had something underneath it. Something that communicated very clearly that this line of questioning was finished. Then she said, "Your grandpa likes the fans on, so the fans stay on." And that they did. I understand now what the fans were for. I've understood this since I was 11. The fans were loud enough to cover the sounds from outside. Almost. That was their entire purpose. They were there so it was harder to hear what was walking around the house at night. I should tell you about the moon. There's a specific memory I keep coming back to, from a summer when I was 8 or maybe 9 years old. I was sitting on the porch with Grandpa after dinner, while the sky was doing its long summer fade from orange to purple, and the moon was rising in the east, enormous and nearly full, a deep amber color. I said something about it, like, "Look at that moon," Or maybe the moon's huge tonight. At first, I didn't think my grandpa was going to say anything. He rocked in his chair and looked at the moon, and he didn't look happy about it like I was. Eventually, he said to me, as if I wasn't even there, "I hate that damned thing." I thought he was joking around. I even laughed, but it came out awkward and forced. He didn't laugh. Over the years, I started to notice a pattern without fully understanding it. Grandpa was worse on certain nights, and it took me a long time to connect those nights to the moon because I was a kid and I wasn't tracking lunar cycles for fun. But looking back, the pattern was unmistakable. On nights when the moon was full, he was tense and vigilant, more alert than usual and more watchful, up later than Grandma. On nights where there was no moon at all, when the sky was just a black field of stars with no light to speak of, he was something else entirely. He was afraid. I don't think I had a word for it when I was young, but that's what it was. On moonless nights, my grandfather was a man in the grip of a real, grinding fear. He would check the locks more than once. He'd sit in the living room long after everyone else went to bed. And come morning, he would look gray and hollowed out, like someone who had spent the night awake and watching for something that might or might not come. Some nights, despite that fan, I could hear things. The fan covered a lot, yes, but it didn't cover everything. And on certain nights, there were footsteps outside that house. They were slow footsteps pacing around, like someone circling something else, taking their time. It would move along one side of the house, pause, sometimes right outside our bedroom window. A pause long enough that I'd be holding my breath in bed, eyes open, seeing nothing because of those blackout blinds, thankfully, and then continue on around the next side. When I mentioned it at breakfast once, doing my best to sound casual about it, Grandma would smile and said that Grandpa had trouble sleeping and he liked to walk the property at night. Said he was checking the animals in the barn to make sure nothing was getting into the feed. Parker, who was old enough by then to hear an explanation and measure it against what he actually believed, asked what exactly Grandpa was searching or checking for. Grandma changed the subject so smoothly, it was almost a magic trick, and before we knew it, we were talking about what we wanted for lunch. One night, I remember getting up to use the bathroom. I think I was 10 years old. The hallway was dark and the bathroom was on the far side of the living room, which meant I had to walk through the main part of the house to get there. As I passed through the living room, I stopped. Grandpa was in his recliner. The TV was off. Every light in the house was off. He was sitting perfectly upright with his deer rifle laid across his thighs, and his eyes were open, and he was staring at the front door. He didn't look at me. He didn't move. He did not acknowledge me in any way. He sat there like a man who had been sitting there for hours, and intended to sit there for hours more, watching that door with deadly focus, as if he expected it, or prayed that it wouldn't open. I went back to bed, and I listened to the fan and the footsteps outside, and I did not go back to sleep for a long time. The last thing I need to mention before I get to the rest of this is the basement. During the day, the basement was fair game. It was an unfinished space with concrete floor, cinder block walls, exposed ceiling joints, and it held the washer and dryer, a bunch of storage shelves, and a workbench Grandpa used for small projects. It had these narrow slit windows that sit at ground level from the outside, wider than they are tall, hinged at the top so they could swing inward for ventilation. During the day, Grandpa sometimes propped them up to air out the place. After dark, the basement, though, was off limits, and the way Grandpa communicated this was different from his other rules. Those other rules, the blinds, the fans, the inside before stars rule, those were enforced through routine. He just did them and you fell in line because that's how things worked. The basement rule was the only one he ever stated out loud, directly looking right at us. He said, "You do not go in that basement after the sun goes down." And his face when he said it was not the face of a man setting a household boundary, but rather someone telling you not to put your hand into a running engine. He was not making a rule as much as he was describing a very real danger. For years, that's what summers were. The days were creek water and crawdads and the smell of cut grass and Grandma's fantastic cooking. But the nights were blackout blinds, locked doors, the drone of a box fan drowning out whatever moved in the dark outside. I accepted all of this. I was a kid. It was part of my world. Like Santa Claus, you accepted these kinds of things without analysis. This was Grandpa's house, and these were Grandpa's rules, and the world at Grandpa's house simply worked differently than it did at home. So I never really questioned it, and I followed every rule to the letter, right up until the summer I turned 11. That was the summer Grandpa had his stroke, when the rules came apart, and I finally truly learned what all of it had been for. Now, I know I said the last thing I would mention before the real story would be the basement thing, but there is one more thing I need to tell you before I get to what happened the summer I was 11. This is the story my grandfather told me on the porch. I was around 9 or 10. It was a full moon night. I remember that because the moon was the reason I was outside at all. I couldn't sleep despite the fan, or maybe because of it. My throat felt like sandpaper, and I needed some water. When I padded out to the kitchen to get some, I could see through the gap at the bottom of the living room blinds. The porch was lit up silver white, bright enough to read by, and the front door was open to the screen. Obviously, this was all very bizarre. Grandpa never left doors open at night, never had the blinds in a way we could peek through them. But there he was on the other side of the screen door, sitting in his rocker with the rifle across his knees, staring out at the yard and the tree line beyond it in all that cold moonlight. I pushed open the screen door and he looked at me. I expected him to tell me to go back to bed right away, but he didn't do that. He looked very tired. In fact, I'd never seen him so tired. And I want to say it wasn't like a sleepy kind of tired either. The man looked absolutely worn through, a tiredness that went beyond muscles. He studied me for a second, then he tipped his head toward the other rocking chair. I sat down in it with my feet dangling, because I was too short to reach the concrete. We sat there for a while without talking. The moon was so bright it threw hard shadows across the yard, and the tree line at the edge of the mowed grass looked like a wall someone had built out of pure blackness, but then backlit it from the inside with pale gray where the moonlight caught the upper canopy. It was beautiful enough to take your breath away. Every few seconds, a bat would cut through the light above the yard, there and gone so quick, it was like a glitch in your vision. Then Grandpa began to talk. He didn't look at me when he did, and he didn't raise his voice above a low murmur. It really looked like he was talking to himself rather than to me. He told me a story, and I'm going to relay it here the way I can remember it, which means it might have gaps or rough edges, because I was a child then when I heard it, and he was not a man who knew how to tell a story in any organized fashion. He was blunt and sparse, with a lot left out that he either assumed you'd fill in or preferred you didn't. So here goes. When my grandfather was young, 20 or 21, he said, something had started getting into the livestock on the properties around his family's land. His father, my great-grandfather, raised cattle, and a few of the neighboring families had cattle or hogs or both. Over the span of maybe a month, animals started to turn up dead in the fields and pens, and from the way Grandpa described it, dead was putting it generously. He said the animals were taken apart. He used that phrase specifically. Taken apart. Like a mechanic taking apart an engine. Pieces here, pieces there. organs separated from the body and moved to places they shouldn't be. He said one of the neighbor's heifers was found with its rib cage opened up and emptied out, with the contents arranged in the grass beside it, in what he called a kind of order, though he wouldn't say what that meant, and I wasn't asking. I remember thinking, how is he telling a kid my age all of this? But he kept going. The initial assumption was dogs. Feral dogs were a real problem in that part of the Ozarks. Packs of them could form up out of strays and dumped pets. They could bring down a calf if they were hungry and numerous enough. But the men who looked at the remains said it wasn't dogs, and it wasn't coyotes either. Because dogs and coyotes are messy, frantic killers that tear into whatever they can reach and leave a scattered wreck. Whatever was doing this, it was doing it with a kind of deliberateness, and that did not match any predator that they knew of. Grandpa said his father came back from examining one of the kills and sat at the kitchen table, completely silent. When Grandpa's mother asked him what was wrong, he simply said, "Something's pulling them apart with its hands." Now, nobody called the game warden or the sheriff. This was the rural Ozarks in the early 1950s. These men solved their own problems. My great-grandfather organized a hunt. He put the word out to the surrounding families. Grandpa's Uncle Earl, 2 men from the next property over whose names I've long forgotten, or maybe I never knew, and a cousin of some kind, who I think was only there mostly because he owned dogs that had been used for tracking boar. In total, there were 5, maybe 6 men, including my grandfather, who was the youngest at the time, and was allowed to come because he owned a rifle too, and knew how to use it, and because his father was not the kind of man you argued with successfully. They went out on a night when the livestock killings had been at their worst. Grandpa said they waited for the moon to be up so they'd have light. They brought rifles and lanterns and the tracking dogs, 2 of them, big bony hounds with scarred up ears, and they went into the trees behind my great-grandfather's property at around 10 o'clock at night. Grandpa told me about this part of the hunt in pieces, and some of what he said I've had to reconstruct from what I remember, and what makes sense in context. Because, like I said, he was not a natural storyteller, and I was a kid, sitting in the dark, trying to follow an old man's fragmented account of something that happened 40 years before I was born. The dogs lasted about an hour. They went in eager, excited hounds with a scent to follow, heads down and pulling against their leads. But then they stopped, both of them, at nearly the same time. They froze where they stood and began shaking. Grandpa said one of them urinated on itself. They refused to move forward, and they refused to stay quiet. They started to make a sound that he described as a continuous whine, high and thin. Not a game call, but something from when it's gone beyond fear into a place where its brain had stopped working properly. One of the dogs ripped free of its lead and bolted off. They heard it crashing through the underbrush for about 30 seconds, and then the sound faded and they never found that dog. The remaining hound pressed itself against its owner's legs and had to be dragged along for the rest of the night, like a piece of furniture. So after the dogs became useless, the men kept going on their own. They were deep in the timber by this point, in that old-growth Ozark woodland where the canopy closes overhead and the moonlight comes through in patches. Everything between those patches is ink dark. Grandpa said they could hear something moving in the trees around them. He was specific about this part. He said it wasn't moving through the underbrush like a deer or a boar would, pushing through branches at ground level. It was moving above them, in the canopy. He said they could hear branches creaking and snapping up high, the sound of something heavy transferring its weight from limb to limb, and it was fast, much faster than walking pace. He said it circled them for a while, up there in the dark above the lantern light, and the sound of it was like a man running on all fours across treetops, which is an image I've never been able to get out of my head, even though I heard this sitting on a porch 20-some years ago. They kept moving because they were men who had committed to doing something, and because turning back now would have meant walking through the same stretch of forest they had just come through, and whatever was pacing them in the canopy would have still been there. Grandpa said they walked for maybe another half hour, with the sound above them coming and going, sometimes close enough that debris would fall on them, small twigs and bark and pieces of leaf, other times far enough away that they nearly convinced themselves it had gone. The remaining dog had given up walking entirely and was being carried by its owner. Then, the thing came down out of the trees. Grandpa didn't describe this like a dramatic moment. He said it matter-of-factly, like someone saying it started to rain. The crashing above them stopped, and there was a heavy sound about 40 yards ahead of them, like something landing on the ground from a great height. Then, silence. It was Uncle Earl who saw it first. Earl was at the front of the group, a few paces ahead of the others, carrying a lantern in one hand and his rifle in the other. He stopped walking and said very low without turning around, "It's standing up." Grandpa raised his lantern. At the far edge of the light, about 30 yards out where the glow gave way to solid dark, he could see a shape between two trees. He said it was tall, taller than any of them, and Earl was over 6 feet. It was standing on 2 legs, and it was perfectly still. The lantern light was too weak at that distance to give him anything more than an outline, but he said the outline was enough. He said it looked like someone had taken the general idea of a person and built it after stretching the measurements. He said the head set forward on the neck, reminding him more of a vulture, with a long-looking snout or perhaps a nose, and its shoulders were enormous, far too wide for the head they supported. The arms hung past where arms should stop. Then it dropped forward onto all fours, and it was gone. The sound of its movement exploded back into the canopy above them, crashing through the branches heading north, fast and getting farther away. The men stood there in a circle of lantern light with their rifles up, and nobody said anything for what Grandpa estimated was about 2 full minutes. They should have gone home. They all knew that. But they didn't, because Uncle Earl said the thing was heading toward the Dawson property, where cattle had been killed the week prior. And because these were Ozark men in the 1950s, and going home would have been something they'd have to live with for a long time, they followed. The timber got worse as they went north. The terrain broke up into ridges and draws and rocky shelves where the footing was bad even in daylight, and the men started to spread out because you couldn't walk 6 abreast through that kind of country. They kept in contact by calling to each other. Grandpa said his father would shout, and the others would shout back, a kind of roll call every few minutes to make sure nobody had fallen or gotten turned around. The thing in the canopy had gone quiet, or at least they couldn't hear it over the sound of their own movement across the rough ground. Suddenly, there was a gunshot, a single sharp crack that bounced off the ridge walls and came from the east, from Uncle Earl's direction, because Earl had drifted the furthest from the group. Grandpa said everyone stopped where they were, and in the silence after the shot, they heard Earl screaming. He was far enough away that the sound was thin and echoing and hard to locate precisely, but it was unmistakably a man screaming in a register that Grandpa said he'd never heard from a grown person before, and never heard again after. Then there was a second shot, which cut off the screaming. Then nothing, just the trees in the dark, and all of them standing in it. For some time, Grandpa went quiet after he told me that part. He rocked in his chair and looked at the moon, and his hands were still on the rifle across his lap. I could see that even decades later, The memory of that silence after the second shot was costing him something to sit with. I waited because even at 9 or 10, I understood that you don't interrupt a man when he's in a place like that. When he started again, his voice was flatter. He said they'd found Earl's rifle at the bottom of a draw, wedged between two rocks. It had been fired twice, both rounds spent. There was blood on the rocks and on the ground, a lot of it, and there were drag marks leading down into a ravine so choked with brush and fallen timber that they couldn't push through it in the dark. They stood at the edge of that ravine, calling Earl's name until the sky started to lighten up in the east. My grandfather didn't tell me what they found when they went back in daylight. He said, "They told his wife it was an animal attack." I noticed that phrasing even then, young as I was. They told her. He didn't say it was an animal attack. He told me what they told her it was, and the gap between those two things was wide enough to fall into. The official family story, the one I'd heard at Thanksgiving tables and funerals my whole life, without knowing it had any connection to my grandfather's property, was that Earl had died in a hunting accident, had shot himself, and by the time the search party had reached him, animals had gotten to the remains. A tragedy, but the kind of tragedy that happened in the rural Ozarks. People accepted it because it was the kind of thing that could be accepted. Grandpa sat with me for a while longer after he finished. The moon had moved since he'd started talking, and the shadows in the yard had shifted with it. The tree line looked different than before. Not to say it was menacing, exactly, but more aware. Like when you walk in a room and you didn't know that someone was in there and they never announce themselves. You simply see them suddenly. Eventually, he looked at me, and his eyes were clear and direct. He said, "There's something in those woods that doesn't have a name, and it's smarter than you want it to be. That's why we have the rules. You understand?" I nodded. "The worst nights are the new moons," he said. "On a full moon, you can see it coming. On a new moon, it can see you, and you can't see a thing." He told me to go back to bed then, and I went. I pulled the sheet up to my nose, and I listened to the box fan roar. But I did not go back to sleep that night. In the morning, I looked out the window at the tree line in the early sunlight. It was just trees, the very same trees I'd played under the day before. But now they meant something completely different. After that night on the porch, I never doubted or wondered about the rules again. I would pull the blinds down myself, turn the fan on before anyone told me to, and I would be the first inside before the first star even showed, every single time without being asked. The footsteps outside some nights that Grandma said were Grandpa checking on the animals. I knew what those were now. My grandfather was not inspecting the barn. Grandpa wasn't even outside. Something in those woods had taken my grandfather's uncle apart in a ravine 40 years ago, and it was still here. I understood the rules. I followed the rules. And those rules kept us safe every summer of my childhood, until the summer my grandfather collapsed in his kitchen with a mug of coffee shattering on the linoleum and the left side of his body going slack. Suddenly, the only person who truly knew what the rules were for was unconscious and driven to a hospital. Grandpa's stroke happened one morning in the middle of our second week during that stay. He was standing at the counter pouring coffee from the percolator, the same thing he did every morning at the same time, and his left hand simply opened on its own and let the mug fall. It hit the floor, breaking into 3 pieces, and coffee went everywhere. Grandpa looked down at it, then looked at Grandma, and said, "Joyce, there's something wrong with my arm." Then he sat down in a kitchen chair heavily, like someone had increased the gravity in the room, and the left side of his face slid downward and stayed there. Grandma called 911, She called Aunt Diane too, who lived 4 hours away in the suburbs outside St. Louis. Then she did what she could, which was to hold Grandpa's right hand and talk to him in a steady voice while the three of us stood in the kitchen doorway, watching, not knowing what to do with ourselves. I remember that the ambulance took a long time to get there. That's how far out we were from anything. They loaded Grandpa onto a stretcher. He looked so small and frail. I remember thinking that my grandpa might die, and I was scared. This man, who had been the largest presence in every room he ever entered, now looked like a gray-faced old man with only one working hand. Grandma couldn't go with him, not until Aunt Diane came, and once Aunt Diane showed up, Grandma left in a hurry. I remember just after she left, looking at the blinds on the windows, thinking that no one in this house would know to pull them down, and why. Aunt Diane and her husband Cal arrived around 3 in the afternoon, hugging Grandma and wishing her and Grandpa the best as she left. Aunt Diane was Grandpa's youngest daughter, a very sweet woman with a loud laugh who worked as an office manager somewhere. She drove a minivan and had probably not spent a full night in this house in 15 years. Uncle Cal was fine, a big, soft-spoken guy who sold insurance and was decent with kids. He gave lots of those cheesy kid compliments and high fives, like, "Good job, sport," that kind of thing. They were the kind of adults you'd want around during a family emergency, for sure. Warm and capable. Aunt Diane spent most of the evening on the phone with the hospital and with other relatives, leading a sort of crisis management with the family. Uncle Cal ordered pizza from the one place that would actually deliver that far out, which took over an hour. He even let us eat it in the living room in front of the TV, which Grandma never allowed. That first evening, I kept waiting for someone to start the routine, hoping someone was watching the sky and would call us inside if we were outside, or go room to room with the blinds, setting up fans, locking doors. But nobody did. The sun went down and the windows stayed uncovered, and the doors stayed latched with their regular locks, not with the deadbolts. No chain, no barrel bolt, nothing. The fans stayed in the closet where Grandma stored them during the day. That house felt utterly naked, like a body without skin. Everything that was supposed to be protected was now open and exposed to whatever was out there. I almost said something. I stood in the hallway and rehearsed it in my head. Something about how Grandpa liked the blinds down and the fans on. Something casual that wouldn't require me to explain why. But I couldn't figure out how to say it without sounding strange. I was 11 years old, but the weight of adult attention during a crisis was paralyzing, so I didn't say anything. I went to bed in the guest room with Parker and Leia. The window was uncovered, and the fan was off. I lay there in the most awkward silence, so enormous and wrong, I could hear my own heartbeat. I slept eventually. The following day was almost normal. Uncle Cal took us outside. We rode the three-wheeler and threw rocks in the creek, and Aunt Diane drove to the hospital, coming back in the late afternoon with a cautiously optimistic report. Grandpa was stable, responsive, but they were keeping him for observation and tests. There was also talk of moving him to a larger facility in Springfield. She looked exhausted. Uncle Cal made spaghetti for dinner. It was watery and undersalted, but we all ate it. Nobody had the energy to care about food quality at the time. That evening, Parker pulled me and Leia aside in the hallway. I could tell he was being very sneaky about something. "They don't care what we do," he said, meaning Aunt Diane and Uncle Cal, who were back on the phone in the master bedroom with the door mostly shut. "We should stay outside tonight, after dark. We're never going to get that chance again." Leia looked at me. I could tell she wanted me to say no so she wouldn't have to. And I nearly did. But Parker was 13 and I was 11. At that age, that's a big gap. And some part of me, The side that was tired of being so afraid every summer. Tired of the fans and the blinds and the locked-down feeling of Grandpa's nighttime house. That side wanted to know what the property was like after dark. I'd spent years sealed inside while the world outside continued without me, and I wanted to see it. So I said okay, and Leia said okay because I had, and Parker grinned. We went out the back door at around 8:30, with the sky still holding on to the last orange glow in the west, but the east had already gone to deep blue. The very first thing that struck me was how different the property sounded at night. The creek, which was a pleasant background murmur during the day, was loud, more present, so to speak, in the dark, even aggressive sounding. The bugs were deafening, a whole wall of sound from every direction, cicadas and crickets and tree frogs layering over each other in a pulsing roar that seemed to breathe. And underneath all that was the woods. The tree line was about 60 yards from where we stood at the back of the house, and in the dying light, it looked solid, a dark mass without depth or detail. We had flashlights, 2 of them, from the kitchen junk drawer, but both were so weak that they barely reached 20 feet. Parker swept his across the yard like a searchlight. It revealed a narrow cone of grass and bugs, but nothing more. Beyond that cone was just more dark. He started to walk toward the tree line. Leia and I followed, too scared to be away from our oldest member. For about 20 minutes, it was what Parker had promised, an adventure. We walked along the edge of the trees without going in, shining our flashlights into the first few yards of timber, seeing trunks and underbrush. Occasionally, we found a pair of tiny reflective eyes, probably belonging to some small or low-to-the-ground raccoon or possum. Parker kept up a running commentary during this, about how this wasn't even scary, and that Grandpa's rules were just an old man being paranoid. I let him say those things because I simply didn't know what to say, and I liked the lack of silence. Suddenly, Leia stopped. She was slightly behind me and to my left. When I turned around, she was standing very still with her flashlight pointed at the tree line, about 40 yards south of where we were. Her flashlight was weak, and it barely reached the trees at that distance. But at the very edge of its throw, where the light gave up and the dark took over again, there was a shape between 2 trunks that I could not make sense of. It was taller than any of us by a significant margin. It was also narrow, standing on 2 legs, but it was completely motionless. The flashlight was much too dim to give any texture or color, so it remained a silhouette, a vertical interruption in the pattern of the trees behind it, and it was facing us. "Something standing there," Leia said. Her voice was perfectly calm. Parker swung his flashlight toward it. For half a second, both beams hit roughly the same area, and in that combined light, I saw, or I thought I saw, the shape shift, a sudden movement, quickly, like something rearranging its posture. Leia's light flickered then. These were cheap, battery-powered flashlights. In that half-second of reduced light, the shape was gone. Just trees. Just ordinary dark between tree trunks. Parker said it was a deer. He said it with enough conviction that I knew he didn't believe it. And I think Leia knew too, because she was already walking toward the house, and she was walking fast. We followed her, and how we kept from actually full-on running, I have no idea. Perhaps we were too scared to run, but we walked at a pace that was as close to running as you could get. And when we made it to the back door and went inside, shutting it behind us, Parker locked the knob lock and then stood there looking at the deadbolt above it. He looks at us, then half laughs, saying, "It'll be fine." So we left it unlocked, and we didn't say anything else about it. We stood in the kitchen, breathing harder than the walk justified, and Parker then said, "That was fun." But Leia and I stayed quiet. He then said, "We should sleep down in the basement tonight." I felt my stomach drop when he said it. The basement was the other rule, the one Grandpa had spoken out loud with his eyes locked on mine, and hearing Parker propose breaking it felt like hearing someone suggest swimming in a river during a storm. But Parker was already talking about it like it was decided. He'd seen the old Nintendo down there, he said, when Aunt Diane had gone down to do laundry earlier. And there were games, and probably other stuff. And the basement was cool, and it would be like a fort. And he reiterated, when would we get another chance? I looked at Leia. She had her arms crossed over her chest, and she was staring at the floor. We were both wondering the same thing, I think. How much resistance was worth the cost of Parker's ridicule? She must have arrived at the same answer I did, because she shrugged one shoulder and said, "Whatever." And Parker took that as unanimous consent and started gathering supplies. We brought sleeping bags and pillows from the guest room. Parker grabbed a bag of chips and 3 cans of Coke from the fridge. Leia brought a book, which was optimistic. We trooped down the wooden stairs into the basement, and Parker pulled the chain on the single bare bulb at the bottom. The room came to life in harsh yellowish light. Everything else was concrete and shadow. Honestly, for a few hours though, it was great. Parker found the NES under the workbench, still connected to a small TV that must have been old when Reagan was president, and after 20 minutes of blowing into cartridges and fiddling with the AV cables, he got it to work. We played Excitebike, then Duck Hunt without the light gun, just using the controller, which didn't work perfectly, but we didn't mind. Leia found a stack of board games on a shelf, Sorry and Clue and something called Aggravation that none of us had ever heard of. We played Clue on the concrete floor with the chips and soda spread around us, like we were having a picnic. Parker discovered a cabinet near the water heater that contained, among other things, a collection of candy so old that some of it was in packaging I didn't recognize. We tried a few pieces. They tasted like sweetened chalk. We ate them anyway, because adventure was the whole point. Really, it was the most fun I'd had at that house in years, maybe ever. We were loud and stupid and free, and Aunt Diane and Uncle Cal never came down to check on us. For those few hours, the basement was just a basement, and the rules we were used to, they were just the eccentricities of an old man who was currently in a hospital bed 40 minutes away, with tubes in his arm. We fell asleep in stages. Leia went first. She had set up her sleeping bag near the base of the stairs, and was out cold by midnight. Parker lasted a little longer on the sagging couch against the far wall, talking to me about a girl from his school, while his sentences got slower and more fragmented, until they stopped entirely, and his breathing evened out. I lay in my sleeping bag in the middle of the floor. I was between the two of them, looking up at the ceiling joists and the cobwebs, listening to the silence. No fan, just silence. I hadn't really thought about that part until that very moment. I'd been distracted by the games and the food and the novelty of it all. But lying there in the dark after Parker killed the light, the silence of that basement was absolute. No fan roar to fill the space, and no white noise to blur the edges of whatever sounds the night might be making. There was, though, the faint ticking of the water heater, and the even fainter hum of the electrical panel on the wall. But beyond that, nothing. I listened to my cousin's breathing. It was so dark and so quiet. It felt like I was deep, deep underwater. Eventually, and I don't know when, I fell asleep. But when I woke up, I was very cold. Genuinely cold. A damp chill had gotten through the sleeping bag and into my skin. It made no sense because it was July in Missouri, and the basement had been stuffy and warm when we'd come down. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around myself. That's when I felt the draft. Moving air coming from somewhere to my left, carrying a smell that did not belong in that basement. The green, wet smell of outside, of grass and dirt and night air, and underneath it was something else. a warm and sour and biological smell. It reminded me of a dog's breath, but heavier and denser, more concentrated. One of the slit windows was open. I couldn't see it. The dark in that basement was the most complete dark I'd ever experienced, where open and closed eyes were the same thing. But I could feel the outside air coming through it. I could feel that the air was wrong, that it carried the heat and smell of something that was not the night. And every hair on my body stood up at once. I heard it before I could even make sense of it. Breathing. Low and wet, raspy on the exhale. A large animal trying to keep quiet. Something was in the room with us. Something was inside the basement. And it was breathing. It was close. I stopped moving, and I stopped breathing. Every muscle in my body locked into a rigid, frozen state that I did not choose and could not have overridden if I'd tried. My higher brain, the part that reasons and plans and makes decisions, had been disconnected from the controls entirely, and what was running me now was something much older, much simpler. Something that said to me, you must not move, you must not breathe, you must no longer exist. The breathing shifted. It moved through the room, slowly, with a carefulness that was worse than speed, because speed would mean a panicked animal, and this was not panicked. It was methodical. And beneath that breathing, accompanying it, I heard the footsteps, a light, clicking, tapping cadence on the concrete floor. The sound of something with claws, walking on a hard surface, and the rhythm. It didn't match anything that walks on two legs, but it didn't quite match anything that walks on four. The sound of it moving across the concrete floor in the perfect dark was the most alien and dislocating thing I've ever heard. It moved past me, close enough that I could feel warmth coming off of it, the radiant body heat of something large and very alive, and I caught a wave of that smell, that sour, biological, overly wet dog smell. But up close, it was sharper, and there was more underneath it, something that reminded me of blood. It passed within what had to be 2 or 3 feet of my sleeping bag, and I lay there with my eyes wide open in the dark, and I saw absolutely nothing. I felt it go by me, like a weather system. Then it stopped, near the couch where Parker had been sleeping. I heard the breathing change then, faster, shorter, with a sniffing quality, like it was sampling the air around him. Then it moved again, toward the stairs, toward Leia. It stopped. The breathing was maybe 4 feet from my head, 4 feet from Leia's sleeping bag at the base of the stairs. I could hear her slow, unconscious breathing, and the thing's breathing layered over it, and for a span of time that I cannot accurately estimate. Was it 5 seconds, 30, a full minute? Those were the only sounds in the world. Then the thing made a sound, a low and soft sound from deep in its chest, barely louder than the breathing. It wasn't a growl, and it wasn't a whine. It sat somewhere between the two, carrying an emotion I should not have been able to read, but I could. It was interested. Whatever was standing over my cousin in the dark was curious about her. Leia shifted in her sleeping bag, a small unconscious movement, the kind of half roll that sleeping people do, and she made a sound, A murmur, maybe a fragment of a dream, nothing coherent. But then her eyes opened. No, I couldn't see it. I knew because she spoke then. Her voice was muzzy and confused and half asleep, and I heard her say, "Is that a dog? Who let a—" The rest of her sentence was replaced by a sound that I will hear for the rest of my life. A sudden detonation of movement, claws scrabbling on concrete, a heavy, wet impact of a body hitting the sleeping bag, and the sound of the bag being seized and wrenched sideways across the floor so quickly that Leia's confused question turned into a scream that did not sound like language or even a human voice anymore. Just a raw and primal shriek of an animal in terror. It bounced off the concrete walls, filling the basement from floor to ceiling. I heard the sleeping bag dragging, fast, impossibly fast, scraping across the concrete toward the far wall where the open window was. Trust me, I would soon know where that open window was exactly. I could hear Leia thrashing about inside the sleeping bag. The thing had hold of the outside of it and was pulling her. I could hear the fabric tearing in long, ripping sounds as claws and teeth shredded through the outer shell. Parker was screaming from the couch. "What's happening?" And somewhere above us, through the ceiling, I heard the concussive thud of adult feet hitting the floor and running. The dragging reached the wall, and there was a different sound. The sleeping bag being hauled upward, lifted off the ground toward the slit window. The window frame groaned. Leia was screaming in short, breathless bursts, and I could hear the fabric of the sleeping bag catching at the edges of the window, tearing further. I understood, with a sick, lurching horror, that whatever had her was trying to pull her through that window. An 18-inch wide slit window, 4 feet off the basement floor on the inside, but ground level on the outside. Something out there was hauling a child in a sleeping bag up the wall, attempting to drag her through it with the disturbing strength of something I don't want to share a world with. The basement light suddenly came on. Aunt Diane had hit the switch at the top of the stairs, and the bare bulb exploded the room back into existence. Every detail was harsh and yellow again, and suddenly, violently real. I saw the basement. The scattered sleeping bags and the crushed chip bag. The Ness still connected to the silent TV. Parker was now standing on top of the couch, his back against the wall. His face was white and his mouth was wide open. His hands were up near his chest like he was bracing for a hit. And across the room, against the far wall, there was Leia's sleeping bag, hanging. The top half was wedged into the open slit window, pulled upward and bunched into the narrow frame. The bottom half hung down the wall, limp, with Leia's weight inside it, sagging toward the floor. The bag was shredded in long lines, 4 slashes evenly spaced across, and through the tears I could see the color of Leia's pajamas and even the skin of her arm. She wasn't moving or screaming anymore. She had gone silent, so absolutely terrified she'd stopped moving. Then the bag dropped. Whatever had been holding it from outside released it all at once, and Leia and the sleeping bag collapsed to the basement floor in a heap. From outside the window, inches away, just on the other side of that ground-level slit, I heard something move, a single heavy thud, the sound of a large animal pushing off the grass, heading back for the tree line, leaving us there in the aftermath. Uncle Cal came down the stairs 3 at a time, his face aghast. He grabbed Leia off the floor, sleeping bag and all, and carried her rapidly up the stairs. Aunt Diane was behind him, one hand on the wall, the other over her mouth, asking questions. Parker scrambled off the couch and ran for the stairs. I saw him glancing at the still open window several times as he did. I was the last one up. As I reached the bottom step, I too turned and looked back at that window. It was still open, swinging slightly inward on its hinge. Beyond it, through the narrow rectangle of the opening, I could see a strip of the yard due to the light that spilled out from the basement. There was grass, the first few feet of ground outside, and at the edge of the light already pulling back into the dark, there was a pair of eyes. They were low to the ground and caught the basement light like an animal's. A yellow reflective shine. They were close together, but that's all I could see due to the dark. They looked at me for less than a second, but then they were gone, and I swear I could hear the sound of something moving fast through the woods. I ran up the stairs, and I didn't go back down. Leia was physically fine. There were some light scratches from the window frame on her arms and shoulders, a bruise across her ribs where she'd been pinned inside the sleeping bag as it was pulled against the narrow opening. But nothing was broken, nothing that would leave a scar on the outside. Uncle Cal went out with a flashlight, walking the perimeter of the house, while Aunt Diane sat with us in the living room with every light on. Uncle Cal came back about 15 minutes later, said he couldn't find a thing. He started to explain it. It was a bear, he said, attracted to the smell of the food we'd brought down there. And I could see in his face that he was constructing something that he could believe, not something that was currently true, but something that would become true. There was no more sleep to be had that night. We stayed up in the living room together until dawn, with the TV on and the volume up, every light on in the house. Leia sat in the corner of the couch with her knees pulled to her chest and did not speak, nor would she speak in the morning or the morning after that, and she would not talk to me or the rest of us for the remainder of that summer. Aunt Diane called the hospital that night. She was in the kitchen and she was keeping her voice low, but I was in the hallway and I heard most of it. She described what happened. She used the word animal several times and the word window several more. When she stopped, there was some silence, long enough that Aunt Diane said, "Mom, are you there?" But then my grandmother's voice came through, and I could hear what she asked. She had said, "Were the windows closed?" That was her first question. Not if Leia was okay, or what happened, but about the windows. It was like she knew exactly what would have happened if the windows were not locked, or if someone had gone down into the basement where the windows didn't lock. Grandma, like Grandpa, probably knew what was out there, but did not have the first-hand experience like Grandpa had. Grandpa would not have forgotten to lock the place down. But Grandma, in a panic, well, I can't blame her. This was not her fault. I really can't say it was anyone's fault. We were driven home 2 days later. Our summer was over. I hope that makes you understand why the sound of a box fan brings me some sort of comfort, or security might be a better word, because my mind has subconsciously associated things with that event. It knows that before the attack, there was box fan noise when we slept, but on the night of the attack, there was none. So until the day I die, there will be a box fan running full blast in my room, because I do not want to hear what's lurking outside my window. What in the world was that? What kind of creature resembles a thin and sickly werewolf, but can fit through a thin window to drag away children? This story is going to give me nightmares for weeks to come. Good night. Thank you all so much for joining me on my podcast here, called Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. You can listen to and review Unexplained Encounters on your favorite podcast app, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts and so on. It's super helpful. You can find all my narrations on YouTube at Darkness Prevails. Until next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.